Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John Dunn. It's November 11th, 2020, and we are now on part 5 of our gripping, informative, enlightening series of interviews with legendary Mormon journalist Lynn Packer, nephew of Boyd K. Packer. We've done, of the 4 interviews that we've done so far, we've talked about Boyd K. Packer's upbringing, his rise to power. We've talked about Lynn Packer's rise and his interest in becoming a journalist, including his service in the Vietnam War as a journalist. We've shared a 30-minute video of some really important moments where Boyd K. Packer and J. Reuben Clark and Harold B. Lee all got together to sort of change the course of church education. This included a really important book that was published in the mid-1950s, and the book was called, tell us what the name of the book was, The Charted Course of the Church in Education. And if you haven't checked out that 30-minute video in my Lynn Packer series, you really should, because it gives a lot of background for what we're going to talk about today. We spent the morning talking about, in part 4, Lynn Packer's journey, covering the dark side of Mormonism in Utah, things like the Ted Bundy case, the Mark Hoffman case, the Lafferty brothers, and others. And now we're kind of here for the main event. The main event is to cover what Lynn is perhaps best known for, which is the Paul H. Dunn scandal. Lynn Packer spent 15 plus years investigating beloved Mormon general authority Paul H. Dunn, who was so well known and loved for his amazing stories about playing professional baseball for the St. Louis Cardinals and for fighting in World War II, and having his buddy die in his arms and telling stories about faith and patriotism, only to find out that Paul H. Dunn was making these stories up and making a lot of money off of these stories, basing his fame on these stories, and even engaging in an affinity fraud where people were persuaded to invest in schemes where they lost a lot of money based on Paul H. Dunn's reputation. Ultimately, Paul H. Dunn was put on emeritus status, and he's one of the only general authorities in the modern era to be prematurely placed on emeritus status. So it's a really important story, and it exists only because of Lynn Packer. And what I think is really important about this interview is that even though this Paul H. Dunn story, it had a feature in Sunstone magazine, and I think this story was covered in the Arizona Republic, to this day, as I understand it, and Lynn, you can correct me, this story was never really covered in the Deseret News or the Salt Lake Tribune. I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, but more importantly, this is the first time anyone's ever granted you an extended full-length interview to give you the chance to really discuss your investigation, the book, and to have an exchange about the details about this story. Now, tell me what I've gotten right and wrong in my intro.
It's correct. This is the first. When I finished the book in about 2015, I sent out press releases hoping to get at least a review, if not an interview like you're doing for the first time today, with the Salt Lake Tribune, the Deseret News, the television stations, KUED, KUER. I sent out a ton of them. Nobody would touch it. It was similar to when I did the first publishable version of the story many years ago, tried to get it to come out to freelance it, and Utah Holiday wouldn't touch it. I almost got UPI to do it. They backed off, and it was finally the Arizona Republic that broke the story. And the local media, they all did their token, okay, this is what the Arizona Republic reports. So it made a big splash for a few days. Nobody followed up. Nobody went in depth. And I was in Germany when the story broke. So I was interviewed a couple of times by phone. That was pretty much it. So there will be things that some things people will see during this interview, and some things I'll say that will be heard and seen mostly for the first time.
Yeah, and so for me, what this interview is also about is it's not just about the the Paul H. Dunn and how a general authority can deceive so many people, including top church leaders, but it's also about the way that the Mormon Church has used its power, its influence, its money to bury and hide important stories that the membership in the world at large needs to know, using lawyers and pressure and intimidation. Because it just seems outrageous that the Salt Lake Tribune and the Deseret News and KUER and all these different media outlets that are supposed to be covering Mormonism wouldn't cover it. And this could all be sort of and most people today have never heard of Paul H. Dunn. It's so remarkable that unless you live through this, it's gone down the memory hole and everyone's forgotten. And the church is still doing this with stories about sexual abuse, with stories about ecclesiastical abuse, with the church's financials. And so this becomes a really important case study in how the church uses its money and power and legal influence to kill stories and to hide information from its members and from the world. Am I overreaching there?
No, I think that's right. You have times that the church weighs in and tries to use its influence to stop a story. A lot of it is self-censorship. Most of the news outlets know how and where their bread is buttered, and they don't want to. They'll take little shots at the church, but they don't want to get into anything that's really controversial. Sometimes stories pop up where it is inevitably a big part of the story, like the Hoffman fraud bombing story. But other than that, they don't initiate major negative stories about the church. I think that there's been many scandals involving the church, especially finances, come and go without any of the membership generally or general public knowing about it.
Yeah, it's true. So let's go ahead and dig in. And I want to welcome all of our listeners and viewers that are joining us on Facebook and on YouTube. I would love it if you all would share this episode on your social media so that we can get as many viewers and listeners as possible. Of course, you can share it afterwards as well, but we would love to get lots of people learning about this stuff. And to begin, I have a few clips that hopefully give a sense of for kind of what we're talking about here. But if you want, can you just give a really quick introduction to the life of Paul Dunn? Just a little bit of a biographical sketch, a couple minutes, nothing more, just so people can have an introduction to his early life and who he is.
I was a missionary. I think it was 1964. I was in Germany. I remember I was in our apartment. It was in Bochum, Germany. We had an apartment above a sort of a strip joint. I won't forget the apartment that I was in. And we would get the Improvement Era in the mail and look forward to getting it. And I remember that's the first time I read Paul Dunn has been made a general authority. There was a sort of a drawing of Paul Dunn as a baseball player with the story. And my first thought was, as I read this, it's about time. We've had so many people when they're older and have boring jobs and careers who
my dad,
younger guys don't identify with being called as general authorities. But here we have somebody who was a professional baseball player. He was a war hero, and he's young. And he as we discussed before, he sort of took over my uncle's position. My uncle was really young when he first started going up the ranks, and a lot of people admired him for that youth and identified with him that way. And now you had Paul Dunn come along, who could do my uncle one better, because my uncle served in the Pacific, but was after action ended, and Dunn was in the thick of the war in the Pacific. And you throw in this baseball career, that's pretty exciting stuff. And, you know, as time goes on, you learn a little bit more about him, that he was from Southern California, that he grew up in Hollywood. That's some more glitz that's added to it. And very quickly, he begins associating with the rich and famous of Mormons, showing up with athletes, famous athletes.
Dale Murphy of the Atlanta Braves,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Steve Young of the San Francisco 49ers.
Then, as I pointed out from the last part of the last interview, I grew up very involved with sports. I loved sports, followed baseball, football, all of it. And so all of these Mormon athletes start showing up with Paul Dunn. It was great. I thought it was a huge plus for the church to call someone like that, and I think it's the main reason he was called. He had done a lot of firesides around Southern California, and remember, this is on the heels of a temple being built, I think on Sunset Avenue, I think is where it is, not far from UCLA. And so a lot of general authorities were going back and forth and heard about this rising star who was a seminary teacher. I have a friend who took seminary from Paul Dunn. The students loved him because he told all these stories and inspired them.
Yeah. And he really was a big deal. And to help illustrate that, now I'm going to share, this is going to be a multimedia presentation where we're going to be sharing Paul Dunn clips and other clips as a part of the interview to give you both a visual, but also an auditory kind of sense for what we're talking about. So the first thing I want to do, I'm going to share two things. One is an introduction that Mormon apostle Jeffrey R. Holland, and I don't know if he was an apostle at the time that he did this, but he was probably president of BYU, but it's an introduction that Jeffrey R. Holland makes to Paul H. Dunn in all the reverence and the majesty of kind of a BYU devotional with his general authority voice and an introduction with all the reverence. I'm going to share that, and then I'm going to share another BYU devotional that happened while I was on my mission in 1988. I'm guessing one of Paul H. Dunn's last. And it was like a packed room, like people were sitting on the rafters. It was like so huge. And they have Steve Young, you know, famous quarterback Steve Young from the San Francisco 49ers on the stage giving a talk before Paul H. Dunn talks. Steve Young is kind of like the, you know, he's the vegetables in the meal. Paul Dunn is the meat of the meal of the presentation. So I'm just going to share this with you guys now so you get a sense for the majesty of Paul H. Dunn.
It is a pleasure to introduce Elder Paul H. Dunn, noted author, educator, friend, one who is well known to the BYU student body as evidenced by your attendance here today. Elder Dunn has served as a member of the First Quorum of the 70 since 1964. A native of Provo, Elder Dunn graduated from Chapman College in 1953 with an A.B. in religion. The following year, he received a master's degree in educational administration at the University of Southern California. In 1959, he earned a doctoral degree in that same discipline there. A popular speaker among church members of all ages, Elder Dunn is the author of some 16 books. He served as a seminary teacher and as coordinator of LDS Institutes of Religion in Southern California for several years prior to his call as a general authority. Elder Dunn was an outstanding athlete in school, participating in baseball, football, basketball, golf, and track. He also played professional baseball for 4 years with the St. Louis Cardinals. In 1972, he was named Utah's Father of the Year. And in 1975, he was picked as one of the top 7 former athletes in the United States by the National Association of College Coaches.
So that's a little bit of a clip to kind of understand the majesty of Paul H. Dunn. Denise writes, "What year is this? I feel like I was there." I don't know about that clip with Jeffrey R. Holland, but the one that I'm about to show, I believe, is 1988, which was an assembly at BYU, where Steve Young spoke. And there's a couple things that are relevant about this this Steve Young clip that I'm about to show.
Well, let me comment on this.
Go ahead, Lynn, please.
Is that he was not a four sport athlete in high school. He only played baseball. He was.
Well, we're going to get to all that.
Well, yeah,
we're just building the majesty, but go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to mention it as it goes, as you go along, because nobody checked into this. You could have easily checked into it. You could have checked into whether he played college ball of any kind, and yet he succeeded in getting named one of the top college athletes. He never played any kind of college ball. But okay, go ahead. I just wanted to point that out.
No, that's an important point. And there's all sorts of things now we can look back and say, why didn't we know? But what I'm gonna show now is we're not going to show Paul Dunn yet, but what I'm going to show is some BYU administrator introducing Steve Young, who then speaks briefly about Paul H. Dunn. And the reason why I'm sharing this, there's a couple reasons. Number one is that you get a feel for the majesty of like how much reverence Paul H. Dunn had. You'll hear the BYU administrator say that Paul H. Dunn is the second most beloved Mormon in the world, next to the prophet. And I think that's accurate. But then he goes on to basically talk about the formula for why they're having this assembly with Paul H. Dunn and Steve Young. And the whole goal is to make you feel the Spirit, to make the participants feel the Holy Ghost through these inspired stories. And so it's going to be tipping the hand to what a theme is going to be for this entire presentation, which is, and this is why I shared that 30-minute video that you produced a couple episodes ago. It shows that you know, the church in the 40s and 50s was getting beat up by science, by evolution, by the age of the earth, by geology, by Egyptologists, by scientists, you know, scrutinizing the Book of Mormon. And the church realized that it needed to pivot away from an emphasis on scholarship and academics and science and towards this education by emotion, where you get people to feel powerful emotional things, and then you tell them that means the church is true. And that's going to be that was Paul Dunn's shtick, making people feel good so that they would believe that the church was true, and he had the church's full backing. And so I just have to say that as an introduction, because you're going to hear the formula explicitly outlined in this video. And then it gets a little bit better. Steve Young literally says that like 4/5 of his testimony as a boy was based on the stories of Paul Dunn, which I think is kind of an interesting and a little bit of a sad commentary. But let's go ahead. I'm going to make sure that our audio is set up to work. And what I want to do is share this clip now. So here it is. One second. Okay.
We feel very fortunate tonight to be able to have Brother Steve Young and Elder Paul Dunn, one of our general authorities. Obviously, they do not need any introduction, just by virtue of all of you that are here attest to the fact that you all know them and their reputation precedes them. It's special for us, I think, as Latter-day Saints, to have someone like Steve Young come and be involved with one of the local franchises in the area, and particularly with the 49ers. I think most of you know of Steve's prowess on the football field and how he has distinguished himself both at BYU and in the professional ranks, and the excitement that he brought to the 49ers last year and that we anticipate he will be bringing this year. I think the most important thing, though, that I've been impressed with Steve about, and that is the spirit that he carries with him. Steve is one that comes from an LDS home where gospel principles were taught, where he had the opportunity of growing up, going to the various, participating in the various organizations of the church, and developing his testimony, as many of us had that opportunity, and as many of you have had that opportunity of participating in various church functions and studying the gospel. And he does convey a very special spirit, and we appreciate him being here, and you'll gain and feel that spirit as he speaks to us tonight. And then we'll be privileged to hear from Elder Paul H. Dunn, a member of the Quorum of 70, and probably, I would say, an individual that's probably as revered as much as anybody in the church save the prophet. And we're happy to have him with us, and his wife that joins with us tonight. Elder Dunn has had the opportunity or has been involved in church administration for many decades. He has been throughout the church. He's prolific in both speaking and in writing. And again, I think the thing that comes through most of all, even though he's distinguished himself both as an athlete, as a pitcher with the St. Louis Cardinals, as a PhD in educational circles, but is his spirit. And how, when you see him and meet him and visit with him, he's very easy to talk to. He understands you, and his spirit communicates very well with your spirit. And so it'll be a privilege to hear him and his testimony. Now, our purpose for meeting tonight is so that we might be able to commune one with another and commune with the Spirit of our Father in heaven. And as these brethren speak to us tonight, we'll all have the opportunity of having a personal witness of the things that they bear testimony of. And so we would hope that you would all pray and have a prayer in your heart that you might be in tune with the spirit that they have and with the message that they have to give us, and then to seek and find out if the things that they have told us are true. And we hope that that's the spirit in which we will meet this evening. And for those of you that have not yet joined the church, we have some literature and some books of Mormon that you should feel free to take in the various entrances and exits that you'll find in this building. Again, we appreciate you very much coming this evening, being with us, and we'll now hear from Brother Steve Young.
My dad always taught me that human mind's an amazing thing. It starts to work the second that you're born. It doesn't stop till you get up to speak. And in front of this crowd, you can probably understand that I'm quite humbled. And that as I speak to you tonight and take a few minutes of your time, I might hope that you would listen to the words I have to say as if I was speaking just one-on-one, because as we get a large group, sometimes it can be lost in the size of the chapel, but that I care very, very much about this assignment. I'm tremendously humbled, as I was when I first came to the 49ers to play with one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time, Joe Montana, to learn from him and watch him. All the years that I grew up, I've become a better quarterback being around him. In a lot of ways, I resemble that same experience is very similar to this one in Elder Dunn and growing up with his stories. And I think 3/4 of my testimony came from the many stories that I listened to on tapes and as a young boy in Connecticut. So I'm very humbled to be with Elder Dunn and his lovely wife.
So I just wanted to say it's hard to imagine a more condemning clip to the core epistemological foundation of Mormonism and the church education system, because they just said, we're all here to feel the Holy Ghost, to bear witness to the truthfulness of what's being said. And everybody there felt it. Everybody there got the burning in the bosom. Everybody left knowing the church was true. And the only problem was it was based on lies. But because the church successfully equates warm, positive, inspirational feelings with truth, it's able to really influence so many people when truth is actually, when the teachings can be bankrupt as far as truth goes. And so that for me, that's a pretty important sequence in the history of Mormonism. What do you think, Lynn?
Well, it is. It's unfortunate that, in essence, Steve Young was being used as sort of a prop or example to, it's all in furtherance of missionary work and to inspire people who are already Mormons. Steve Young appeared with Paul Dunn frequently. I went to one of their firesides where they packed the arena up at Weber State, and both of them spoke. I did an interview with Steve Young, it's been a few years ago, by telephone. It was about another story I was working on. I didn't bother to ask him about this because I'm sure that he, like others who spoke with Paul Dunn, are now fairly embarrassed by it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, it'd be hard to overstate his influence. I just pulled together a list of 10 books or cassettes that Paul H. Dunn sold. Books like Seek the Happy Life, Anxiously Engaged, Dimensions of Life, Win If You Will. He did a biography on the Osmonds, The Birth That We Call Death, Look at Your World, Relationships, Self, Family, and God. Lots of, I think Elder Holland said something like 16 books. Is that right?
It was a lot. I had all of them. I think everyone as research for my book. I had his cassettes. I had a lot of material that I drew from for the book.
Is there any way to know how much money he made off of books and cassette tapes?
I don't remember the figures. Early on, I was able to, he was deposed once, and the attorney who did the deposition leaked me his tax returns for that particular year. And I think I put the numbers in the book. I don't recall what they were, but clearly he was making more than most general authorities, probably by a fairly long shot.
Making more money than general authorities.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's worth mentioning your book just here at the outset. I do have a listener that wrote that they downloaded your book last night and started reading it. It's available on the internet, right?
It's, I don't know if there's a digital version. I don't know if you can download it.
Here it is. Russ writes, I downloaded Mr. Pecker's book on Mr. Dunn last night. Interesting read. I recommend it highly. Available on Kindle Unlimited.
Yeah, I think the PDF version is available on Kindle, or if somebody wants the paperback, they can just go to the Amazon bookstore. But yeah, that's right. It first came out as a digital book and then later as a paperback.
Okay. So I think we've made the point about how much reverence and esteem and fame Paul H. Dunn had within Mormonism. And to be honest, just to turn on my charitable hat, he was beloved. He made people feel good. He was inspiring. He made youth want to be moral and to be honest. And, he made you want to have character and integrity and be a hard worker. I was an athlete and I was inspired by his stories. He made you feel patriotic. He made you want to love your country. And if we're going to be fair, there are probably a lot of people that were inspired to do really good things based on the stories of Paul Dunn. Is that fair, Lynn?
Right. And we're inspired to join the church. It's one of the reasons that they did not deal harshly with him when we'll get into this, when it came to the church's attention that all of the stories were made up.
Right. Okay. So I guess now begins, the question that we're all dying to hear is, what made you want to start investigating a general authority. And by the way, for those of you who aren't Mormon, you will maybe not know that we as Mormons, when we go to the temple, let's say when we're 18 or 19, or when we're getting married in our early 20s, we go to the temple and we make very serious covenants. And at the time, we would have made covenants where we literally would made oaths to keep these covenants, in some degree to the expense of our own lives. In other words, these are very serious oaths. And one of the oaths that Mormons take is to never speak ill of the Lord's anointed. And a general authority certainly counts as someone who's anointed from the Lord. And so what in the world would make a journalist in Utah, and specifically the nephew of a Mormon apostle, want to start think and want to start investigating a Mormon general authority?
And that's where the slides I prepared begin. If you go to the first slide, I'll tell you how I got involved. AFCO was a Utah enterprise, a business that was developing a resort at Sherwood Hills. That's in the canyon Sardine Canyon between Brigham and Logan, and Glenmore Village, a subdivision out in the West Valley area. And Grant Affleck, that's where AFCO gets its name, is seen there in the circle. He was the president of the company, or the CEO. His attorney, Carvel Schaefer, is next to him in this photo. And for listeners who can't see what it is, this is a ribbon cutting in about 1979 when the Sherwood Hills Resort, was opened. And Paul Dunn is there with the Osmond family, most of the Osmond family, and Paul Dunn and Marie are cutting the ribbon. And so how do I then get into this story?
And I was just, is it pretty much safe to assume that the Osmonds would have been paid to be a part of this promotion, or that they were investors in the scheme?
They got consideration. One of the suites, and it was a promotional consideration, one of the suites, or more than one, at Sherwood Hills was named after the Osmonds, and they were given free access and use. And of course, they would love to have the Osmonds come up and stay, because it would be, publicity for the resort.
Yeah, and so this introduces this idea of a web of Mormon power, Mormon fame, Mormon influence, and Mormon money, and how they all act as a binding and a sealing forces to each other. Is that fair to say?
And this is huge promotion for Sherwood Hills, because Paul Dunn, I think, was the best known general authority, including that he was widely known. He was, like you say, beloved by the church membership. He'd written so many books, and everybody wanted to hear his talks because they were not boring. So I was working at KSL and had just begun working at BYU. So I was working 3 days at KSL, 3 days at BYU. And I got a phone call from my younger brother. My younger brother worked for a title company in Brigham City, and he was bishop of a Honeyville, Utah ward. That's north of Brigham City. And my younger brother, he is since deceased, but he was very active in the church. Like I said, he was a bishop. He was very conservative. We were at complete odds when it came to church doctrine. But anyway, I get a call from my brother, and he says, I'm concerned about something. He said, I have a member. She's, I believe he said, a widow who has just invested money in a company called AFCO. And she invested in condominiums at Sherwood Hills, and as collateral for her loan, she was given a trust deed to a piece of property in Glenmore Village. This was property that was still undeveloped in the subdivision there. He says, I'm concerned about that. He said, I don't think this collateral is worth anything. And he knew I had done investigative reporting, and he wanted me to do a story on it. I said, I'll look into it. He gave me the name of another investor in Brigham City. I talked to them. They gave me some of their records, including the trust deed that they had that secured their, I think it was like a $50,000 loan. And they also said that they immediately got 10% of what they put in back, either for a missionary or to get a car, and AFCO would help arrange for the car if they wanted it, because most of the investors were encouraged to take out home equity loans to pay for this investment. That didn't make a lot of sense to me, because if AFCO gave back 10% of the money up front, you have less money working to make these tremendous interest payments that they were promising. But I made a quick inquiry with the Attorney General's office, and they said they had looked into AFCO and they didn't see a problem with it. I drove to
Oh, and by the way, I mentioned power, money, celebrity. We gotta add government and politics, right?
Yeah.
And media. It's all interwoven.
They said it's okay. So then I went to the Salt Lake County Recorder's office and looked up the trust deed and found that it was in something like 8th or 9th position and worthless, and immediately could detect this is a massive fraud. How did I know it was massive? Because there were other people who had been given the same trust deed as collateral for their loans or their investments that they'd made into AFCO. It was instant. I said, this is a huge scam, and immediately started working on a story, because you have to interview people, you have to find out what's going on. I found out that some of the key salesmen were seminary teachers. That added even more credibility. There was a stake president in Brigham who had invested, and of course the salespeople say, hey, the stake president invested in this. It has to be a good thing. And that's when I started. I had a lot of experience in covering fraud, and knew that would have to be well documented. It was early on that I called Paul Dunn on the phone, because everybody was telling me that was a factor in their investment, that they knew Paul Dunn was on the board of directors of AFCO, and so they invested. And so we could, in a second, jump ahead a couple of slides. Why don't you move to the next slide?
Let me, I think it might be interesting just to play this really brief clip. It shows how Paul H. Dunn and the Osmonds kind of had a relationship. Can I play that really quick?
Yeah.
Okay.
I know which one that is, yeah.
Why don't you come up a minute, would you? All of you, please, all of you. I promise, as I did in the concert, I will not sing. We're sorry Donnie and Burl and brother and sister Osmond can't be here. They're either ill or on other assignments.
And that's, there's nothing particularly scandalous about that clip, other than that it just shows, tens of thousands of people worshiping in a religious context, and then celebrities are brought out to help kind of drive home the feeling and the excitement. And I think this is going to be relevant when we talk about Tim Ballard and Operation Underground Railroad in our next segment. But anything else you want to say before we go on?
Right. He was known as the general authority to the Osmonds, and had a very, very close relationship. They were sort of using each other, and certainly he was using the Osmonds to promote his books, to promote himself, and to promote the church. But if you skip the next slide, is I just stuck here in between, and I'll just talk about it briefly, because I wanted to introduce the fact that my Uncle Boyd and Paul Dunn went way back to the 1950s when Paul Dunn started attending some conferences that the church education system was holding at BYU, summer conferences where they go to learn new policies to get fired up about what they're doing. And my research shows that they were at the same conference in 1954, and Dunn had just barely started teaching seminary in California, and Boyd had been teaching for a few years at that point. And they clashed back at that time. So these two men knew each other that far back. And this will become part of the story as Paul Dunn becomes suspicious as to who put me up to do these stories. And as my Uncle Boyd becomes concerned, because whether he likes or dislikes Paul Dunn, he doesn't want any negative story like that to come out about the church. So if you then go to the next slide, these are a couple of images taken from one of the early stories that I prepared about AFCO. This would be early, like this would be late 1981, around November, as I started putting the stories together by interviewing people. And in this case, what I'm doing is showing the flip chart that AFCO salesmen used to sell these investments. And it's very similar to the flip chart that I used on my mission that we also called a flip chart, and you would flip through and show various things. And this was one of the most prominent features of the presentation, that the Osmonds have a suite at this resort, and that Paul H. Dunn not only cut the ribbon with Marie Osmond, but is on the board of directors, that he's a director of the company. So how could anything be wrong if you have an inspired, well-known general authority being on the board of directors? And as I just mentioned a minute ago, there were several seminary teachers and returned missionaries who were using this flip chart to go sell these investments. Then you could probably go to the next one, where here's what happened is I was prepared to do a story by about November of 1981. You just don't jump on the air with a story like that. You have to do a lot of research, do a lot of interviews, a lot of double checking. You have to give, I did an interview with Grant Affleck. I did a telephone interview with Paul Dunn, asking him about his role. And he admits that he's involved with the company. But then the problems arose trying to get the story on the air. I just could not get KSL to run the story. I was given one excuse after another. It's not quite there. You've got to do more. It's not there. And as I show in the slide, is that Spence Kennard held up the story for many weeks. Spence was the news director, and he held it up for various reasons. And it wasn't until years later that I talked to Spence, and Spence said, after you interviewed Paul Dunn and started working on the story, he called me and cautioned me about running the story. I didn't know that.
Kennard did.
Yeah, he admitted it. Yeah. He had a little story to tell about what was going on at his house when he got the call. So he didn't forget where he was and what was going on when he got the call. It's just an example of.
What did he say? How did he justify not running the story?
Pardon?
How did he justify not running the story?
Well, he didn't tell me that he was either being pressured or encouraged by Paul Dunn himself. He would say, "You're faxed." Remember, these are risky stories to do because they could attract libel suits and could cost the station hundreds of thousands of dollars fighting a lawsuit. And so you should be careful. You have to double and triple check facts. You have to have your attorney look over the story. You have to make sure you've given the other side a sufficient chance to respond, which I thought I had done. I was frustrated. And in the meantime, AFCO is getting into more serious trouble and is selling to more and more couples who are putting their homes up for mortgage on second mortgages. And most of these people will go through the early stages of losing their homes because AFCO, as part of the package, was supposed to make the payment on these second mortgages. And it was a pyramid scheme. They were getting new investors so that they could pay mortgage payments on the old investors, a classic pyramid scheme. And pretty soon it collapsed. They couldn't make payments. And then these lending institutions start telling the people, you've got to pay. I don't care if AFCO says they're going to pay, you've got to pay. And they started foreclosure proceedings on lots of houses. There were, as I understand it, there were divorces that came out of this, and I think there was at least one suicide over somebody who had invested and just didn't see how they were going to come out of it because they were going to lose their home. And you had a lot of spouses at each other's throats after it started going down, because usually it's one spouse or another who believes, yes, we should take this chance. We should put our house into deeper hock because we get this 10% up front and it's a sure thing, and we get far more interest than if our money is in the bank. And Grant Affleck used to use the line, awaken the sleeping giant that's in your house. You have this investment in your house, you have this equity build up, use a home equity loan to make this investment. And it just turned out to be a disaster for dozens, if not maybe perhaps hundreds of Mormon families, mostly Mormon. Some non-Mormons did invest. And so while KSL was sitting on the story, there's perhaps dozens of families invested. And remember, AFCO is going down and they need these new investments to pay off old investors. And they were just absolutely desperate to make any money any way they could. And so it was not until March, like 3 months. And it wasn't until AFCO actually took out bankruptcy that we broke the story. And it was hardly breaking the story, even though we could have, because by then, all other media got a hold of it. It was a big deal. I mean, it was a high profile bankruptcy.
And what year was this?
It was 1982.
The story broke.
About March of 1982, somewhere around there.
And I just have to say, this is another example. If I had to pick two people that were influential to me as a youth, it was Paul H. Dunn and Spence Kennard, because I used to love music in the spoken word.
Sure.
And before the guy who does it now, Spence Kennard did music in the spoken word. And he was so charismatic, so eloquent, so strong. You know, you just felt the Holy Ghost when the Mormon Tabernacle Choir sang, and then when Spence Kennard shared the spoken word. And it was much to my chagrin when he was removed from his position. And I guess you can tell us why he was ultimately removed from his position.
Well, he was. I was, at the time this happened, I was in Germany teaching in Dortmund, and called my wife, and she said, "Have you heard about Spence?" And I said, "No." That he had been fired from KSL and taken off the spoken word because of an affair he had with one of the, I think she was an anchor, one of the reporters there. And of course, Elaine and I knew Spence and Lynette, his wife, really well. My brother-in-law and sister lived in their ward in Fruit Heights. And of course, knew Spence really well. Spence was news director during KSL's glory years. We were a solid #1 in the ratings. KSL was making a lot of money. I think I mentioned before, you couldn't pass two people on the street without them recognizing you, because local news was so heavily watched back at that time. And Spence had put together an excellent news organization with a lot of good reporters. Spence had a lot of experience. He not only had worked as a reporter, but I think he went back to Columbia to get either his master's or some sort of internship so that he had those credentials. He did some work for CBS News. I think he knew Walter Cronkite because one time Spence and I went to a conference, CBS conference in New York, and he took us up to the CBS newsroom, and introduced me to people that he knew. So it was tragic that he handled that story that way, and tragic the way his career came to an end because he was such a gifted reporter and news director.
But to me, this theme that I'm going to keep coming back to is it's kind of like church power, church money, church general authorities, and then lawyers and control of the media, and then strong interwoven financial interests within the community. These are in so many ways the lifeblood of the Mormon community, and they're what keeps the church strong and healthy, because there's so much money, so much power, so much influence, all in government, all of it's interwoven. And it's kind of like a theocracy a little bit.
Yeah, and in fairness to Spence, after the story broke, because I had the experience and knowledge about it, is that I wasn't taken off the story. It wasn't like, okay, we don't want you on the story, because over the next 2 or 3 years, other AFCO-related stories developed because there were several major lawsuits in federal court against the lending institutions, saying that they should have known that this was bad, and you can't foreclose against all of these homeowners. And most of, if not all of those lawsuits were won in favor of the homeowners. I covered those in federal court. And then the biggie, Grant Affleck's trial in federal court, his criminal trial, I covered that along with Jack Ford. And then I think it was a year later, Carvel Schaefer, I think he was either president, he was the attorney, he was one rung under Affleck with AFCO. He was tried and convicted as well. And that's an interesting story because after he was convicted, Orrin Hatch took steps to get him his sentence reduced so he didn't spend that much time in jail. The other thing that's interesting, and I think this fact is correct, is that Grant Affleck was excommunicated from the church, which is often the policy if you're convicted of a crime, a felony. But Carvel Schaefer was not. Carvel Schaefer got, I think, preferential treatment from both the court, through Orrin Hatch and the church.
And what was his role again?
He was, I think the way it was at the time is that Affleck was CEO and Carvel Schaefer was president.
Got it.
But for sure, Carvel Schaefer was the attorney. He was one who packaged a lot of this stuff. He would have been the one reviewing these deals to see if they complied with the law.
Got it. So I guess we can tie this back now to Paul Dunn and kind of what put you on the trail, right?
Well, right. So what happened is I had interviewed Paul Dunn on the telephone early on in the story. And this was probably a month or so before the story broke. Could have been 2 months before. And Paul Dunn admitted that he was on the board of directors. And, and his attitude was, well, what's wrong with that? Watch your step here. Why are you looking into this? That was sort of his attitude. It wasn't, the interview wasn't very long. And so then he gets an attorney assigned to him, Jim Jardine, who was a regional representative. And I think it was pretty much the church that assigned him. And then I start hearing these rumblings that Dunn had resigned from the board. more than 3 years previous, and that the bad guy was Grant Affleck, who continued to use his name and falsely tell investors that Paul Dunn was still on the board of directors. That didn't exactly square with what Dunn had told me. Why didn't Dunn tell me, hey, I resigned 3 years ago. Why are you even talking to me? That was not the case. And so the pressure mounts as the story unfolds. It was a huge story in Utah. Everybody was covering it. It quickly became known as the biggest fraud in Utah history. It was so widely covered and had triggered so many major lawsuits, and you had so many people in the process of losing their homes because of this investment. So Paul Dunn needed to distance himself. And as soon as he got an attorney, Jim Jardine, to represent him, I made contact with Jim. And of course, the deal is now you go through the attorney. It's protocol, it's journalism and legal ethics that you no longer try to talk to the person who's being represented. And Jim said, let's have breakfast together. So we had breakfast at, what's the name of the restaurant just north of the courthouse? It was a fish restaurant. I don't remember which the name.
Street Grill?
No, it wasn't that, but it was, in any event, we had breakfast there. And I'll never forget, is Jim Jardine said.
And let me just make a point. This is a Mormon general authority.
He's a regional representative.
A regional rep, which is the equivalent to an area authority now.
Right.
Which we all think of as a general authority, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he's a fixer. He's an attorney that the church brings on as a general authority, not necessarily for spiritual or ecclesiastical, pastoral concerns, but to act as an attorney who's a fixer for problems that erupt in the church. True?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's assigned to do it. So we go to this breakfast. And he says, Lynn, one thing I've learned is that if there's a problem with his relationship with AFCO, the best thing to do is to get the facts out quickly and completely, because the cover-up could quickly become the major story. That's him telling me that. And I said, right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you what I've learned and give you a chance to respond. And so as I continue with the investigation, I'm giving this information to Jim Jardine and giving him a chance to respond. And one of the first things he does is and I remember I was at the station when he did it because I was working on a story. And he said, I have proof that Paul Dunn resigned from the board in 1978. That was 3 years at least earlier. And he said, I'm going to bring it by and give it to you. And I think I've got a slide of the document. This is the document that he brought me. This is a copy of the very one. 1978, please be advised of this date, I am withdrawing my position as a board of director of AFCO and its subsidiaries. Thanks, I'm gone. And like I said, this did not square with what Paul Dunn had told me. Why didn't he tell me this? And so it didn't seem credible. And it took me years before I developed absolute proof that this is a fabrication. It's a fake letter that was done on a church letterhead that was written not in 1978, but early 1982 and backdated to 1978.
And tell me if I'm wrong, what this represents is evidence that two Mormon general authorities, well, a regional rep or an area authority and a general authority, the lawyer being assigned by the church would be willing to lie and even forge a document so that they could get out of, a public relations nightmare for the church and legal problems. Is that fair to say?
It was Paul Dunn who directed. I ended up tracking down the very day that the letter was generated and the pressure that was on Paul Dunn to extricate himself, because I think especially Gordon Hinckley was saying, hey, you've got to get on top of this. This is really bad, even to have a general authority involved in a business, especially one that's gone bankrupt and has now looked like it's fraudulent. And so this letter was also delivered, I think, the same day to the first presidency to show them, hey, I'm not a part of this. Now, whether Jim Jardine, who delivered it, and he was the one who did deliver it, knew it was fake, I don't know. There was nothing in my research that showed he was in the loop when it was being fabricated. The only question is did he ever ask Paul Dunn, hey, this doesn't make any sense. Is this really real? He at the very least readily accepted it as being a genuine letter of resignation.
Yeah, which wasn't true.
Right. And so I knew immediately when I got this in 1982, it was either late 81, early 82, that it couldn't be genuine, but you can't accuse somebody of fabricating a letter until you have the proof. And so I was always looking for the proof. And it was like more than 2 years later that I found the proof. And so if you go to the next slide, is that what this is a W-2 form that purportedly shows Paul Dunn having played for a professional minor league baseball team. And here's how I got onto the baseball part, because John, as you know, so far I've only been talking about AFCO. I haven't been talking about war, I haven't been talking about baseball. Is that as I was investigating the AFCO part, I did an interview with Grant Affleck's brother. And I asked Affleck's brother if Paul Dunn had resigned from the board. And he said, no, he hadn't, that it was a lie. Of course, he had no proof about how the letter was fabricated, but he said, no, he was with AFCO right up to bankruptcy. And then I said, you mean he's lying about his resignation? I'll never forget this part of the conversation, because he said, well, if you think he's lying about AFCO, you should look into his baseball. I go, what?
His baseball what?
His baseball stories.
Oh, and who is this again? Who is this again?
Pardon?
Who is this again who said that?
This is Grant Affleck's brother.
Okay.
And so I was not one who read Paul Dunn books. I'm not inspired by that kind of thing. So I knew he had played for the St. Louis Cardinals. I knew he had been in the war. I didn't know anything. I didn't listen to the tapes, didn't read the books. So this was news to me. And I said, well, how do you know this? And he said, well, it was a friend of Grant Affleck's, or his, who was a mission president in St. Louis. And Paul Dunn was noted for doing baseball nights, professional baseball nights. It would be Mormon night. The professional baseball teams loved it, because there would be a Mormon night at a professional baseball game. Mormons would show up, and Paul Dunn usually would go out on the mound, maybe with, there might be a Mormon player or some Mormon celebrity, and they would do the little thing, and it would be sort of like a big PR thing for the church. And Paul Dunn was scheduled to do one of these Mormon baseball nights, not just for any team, but for the St. Louis Cardinals, the team he had played for. So it was a big deal. So the mission president, this is the story I was told at the time. So the mission president said, we need to give him a special plaque. He's coming back to maybe a mound he pitched on. But in any event, he's coming back to his ball club. And so we're going to make a plaque. And so they started making a plaque, and he assigned a couple of missionaries to go to the St. Louis Cardinals office and get details about his career. What year did he pitch? What was his record? That kind of stuff. So they sent him off expecting to come back with all of this information. And when they came back, the missionaries told the mission president he never played for the Cardinals. The mission president said, well, maybe we're confused. Maybe he played in the Cardinal organization. The St. Louis Cardinals were known to having the best organization of minor league teams to develop athletes. And they said, no, he never played in the organization. He didn't even play for a really tiny team somewhere out in Podunk. He didn't play for him. And so they canceled the plaque idea. He still did Mormon night, but then the rumor started to spread. And then it got back to me. That's when I decided to look into it, because it comes back to the resignation letter. In a trial, if you're a lawyer and you're in a trial and witnesses contradict each other, there's a jury instruction that's given. It's a standard instruction you hear all the time. And the jurors are told this: if you find that a witness is lying about one thing, and you're convinced that's the case, you're free to infer that they've lied about everything else. So that's why I pursued the war in baseball. It was because if he's lying about that, it could help prove he's lying about resigning from AFCO. It all comes back to AFCO.
Got it.
I was covering the fraud story. I wasn't doing war in baseball. And so this W-2 form was given to me later, because now I'm getting into the baseball stories and I'm hitting Jim Jardine with all of that. And he says, I have proof. I have proof that he played for the Hollywood Stars, and they're not in the Cardinals organization, but it's Hollywood Stars was a really great minor league team. And if you played for the Hollywood Stars, you were damn good if you played for them. And so I was given this W-2 form as proof that he had played for them. And if you look at it carefully on the screen, it's sort of a blurry scan of the W-2 form if you bring it up again. And if you look at the figures at the bottom that show him making $5,000 something odd dollars or whatever, that's all. It's a real W-2 form, but it's had the numbers put in. He did try out. This wasn't the Hollywood Stars. This was this was a really low team. This was the Ontario Baseball Club. He was trying to show he played for any professional team. And this particular one, it was for the Ontario Baseball Club. And what happened is he tried out for the team, and he was on the roster for the first game of the season, and then he was dumped. He was cut. So essentially, he didn't play for the team. He was cut. But he deserved a very small salary. It would have been just dollars. And so he took that W-2 form, falsified it, and made it look like he had pitched even for this really podunk minor league team for a year. And so that was part of his proof. So Paul Dunn is what he is just a really inept Mark Hoffman. He fakes documents to prove something.
Yeah. Okay. So the next slide you have is this one.
Now this is the Hollywood Baseball Club. And this is another piece of evidence that Jim Jardine gave me. And it didn't take long to see that this one was clearly faked, that this one had been produced because...
Describe it for our listeners.
Well, basically just what it is, it says, we're happy to have you join our club. It's like you've apparently tried out and you've made the cut and welcome to the club. And then it's signed by the business manager who would send out a letter like this. And you can see the difference between the two, the one on Paul Dunn's letter and the one of an actual signature of this individual, and it's just clearly forged. And of course, other research shows that he never made that team. He wouldn't have been anywhere near good enough to make a team like that.
And he forged these documents. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, he forged this document. And again, it's not showing he played in the Cardinals organization, but hell, if you can show, hey, I played for some professional baseball team, even though the Ontario team was not good at all, but the Hollywood Stars were very good, a really good team, almost professional, major league quality team, but he wouldn't have made it. Doing the research is that Paul Dunn was a pitcher in high school, and I think we've got that slide coming up in one or two other slides. Can you bring up the next one?
Yeah, and I'll just say, listeners, we've got 600 people that are joining us live right now on YouTube and Facebook, and I would love to get to 1,000. So if all of you could please like this episode, love it, share it on social media. We're still not even yet to the really good stuff. So if all of you could take a moment and share this episode, I would love to get the viewership higher, or at least like it or love it. That would be great. Okay.
So,
and people are writing in and they're saying that lots of Mormon athletes were involved with Paul Dunn, including Dale Murphy, the famous Atlanta Braves baseball player, Danny Ainge, Johnny Miller, the golfer. Lots of Mormon celebrities were involved. So, hey, by the way, is this forgery illegal? And could he have been put in jail for forging this stuff?
Well, another interesting thing is that there was a new law that came out in Utah as a result of the AFCO fraud. And it's a law that would have made it easier to prosecute something like this, but it was not on the books at the time Dunn was fabricating these records. It's a law that is probably going to be used against Operation Underground Railroad, which is going to be a separate broadcast later. And the law basically says it's against the law to use deception to take something away from someone. It can be money or anything of value. And it's possible that this could have violated that law, but in any event, it wasn't on the books at the time. So if you go to the next slide, I just threw this one in there because I later wrote an article for Sunstone magazine about this. And this was one of my favorite cartoons that Sunstone had made, where you have Nephi working on the plates, and he has himself playing for the St. Louis Cardinals, which really dramatically depicts what Paul Dunn apparently did, where he sits down in his office somewhere and starts creating fake documents. The next slide shows.
Yeah, and I mean, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this sort of forgery, some would claim, strikes at the very core of Mormonism, because if Joseph didn't have golden plates and write the Book of Mormon through translation and revelation, if he didn't know how to translate Egyptian and he created the Book of Abraham, if the 3 and the 8 witnesses didn't really see plates or an angel, and instead their names were signed to a document, basically we have a long-standing tradition in Mormonism of making false claims, forging documents, and then using people like Martin Harris and the Cowdreys and the Whitmers and Sidney Rigdon and others, and Emma and women and Relief Society members to be the front for fraud. Well, and it's a scheme that strikes at the very core of Mormonism.
Right.
Is that unfair, or is that fair?
No, and you can see it's just another reason why they didn't want this story to come out, because it had mushroomed out of control. I mean, it was a bad story with Dunn, having been on the board of a major fraud, and it gets worse if there's a cover-up, especially if the cover-up involves faking documents. And remember, if you go to the next slide, there's an image of Jim Jardine Remember, he's the one that I had breakfast with, who said the cover-up is often, the story of the cover-up is often worse than the story about the crime, and that's why I want the facts to come out quickly. And yet he was the one that started delivering, literally turning over these fake documents. Then it's the next slide that shows Grant Affleck having been arrested for fraud after the case reverted back to the Attorney General's office that had muffed the case before, but then it was quickly switched over to the U.S. Attorney's office where the FBI could engage and others, and eventually Grant Affleck was arrested. This is what's known as a perp walk. A perp walk is when reporters are told that a perpetrator is going to be taken either to jail or to the courthouse for arraignment, so you can be there with cameras. Normally, what they do is negotiate with the attorneys so that the defendant avoids this embarrassing shot. But in this case, the investigator, Mike Hines, who is walking Grant Affleck into court, apparently for his arraignment or one of the hearings, tipped me on this. So this is a shot from our news camera when we did the story about him being arrested. Now, one of the charges against Affleck was that he used Paul Dunn's name without his permission. Oh, I see my camera's frozen up again. Do you want me to fix that?
Keep talking. I'll add it back when your camera revives. Keep talking.
Okay. So anyway, one of the charges in the indictment was that he had used Paul Dunn's name without permission to use the scam. And I am certain knew that that wasn't the case, knew that Paul Dunn had been active in the company up until the end, but they were playing ball. They had made a decision fairly early on that even though Paul Dunn could have been charged in this, they weren't going to do it. The excuse that I was given by the U.S. attorney is that had they charged Paul Dunn, it would have turned this into such a huge sideshow that they possibly would have lost. The jurors would have sided with Paul Dunn, even if evidence had been shown that he faked his resignation and was really with the company. But in any event, that was one of the charges that was against Grant Affleck.
And Lynn, I don't know if you can stop your camera or start it or do whatever you've done in the past to get that going again.
If I can get it restarted.
But while you're doing that, I can go to the next slide.
Okay,
but keep working on your camera so we can get you back on.
Okay, let me see if I can find.
And I'll just thank all our listeners who are joining us. And we're getting different types of comments from our listeners. And, one of them is John Wetman writes, the Hall of Fame Detroit Tigers pitcher Jack Morris, World Series MVP and BYU legend, separated from Paul Dunn during this period, along with Johnny Miller and Danny Ainge. Roger writes, this news broke while I was on my mission. I had been a big Dunn fan up to that point. A lot of people were really disappointed by what happened. Peg writes, I left the church and then I came back. Don't ask me why. I kept asking about what happened to Paul Dunn and never got an answer. It's another deep, dark secret. It didn't look good for the church. And so, yeah, there's somehow the church is able to just have these stories that should be kind of scandalous, that should really, really put the church in jeopardy. And in many cases, people lose their life savings, like you said, Lynn. And somehow what happens is the church isn't harmed and the church ends up thriving, and these stories get forgotten. And then more and more of these scandals occur and reoccur. And I just can't tell you, every single year in Chicago, in Dallas, I hear about different Mormon celebrities that back certain financial propositions, schemes, Highland, Alpine, Salt Lake, anywhere you can think of, Logan, and people lose their life savings, their homes. They lose everything because of these types of scandals. They just keep happening over and over again. And it's a real tragedy. Lynn, how's your camera?
I'm just seeing if I can switch over to another camera. For some
There you
reason,
go. You're back.
for some reason, it kicks my cameras out, and I've switched over to another.
This is a great camera. Let's just stay on this one.
We may have to do this again, but let's see how far we can get with this.
Okay.
With this camera. So anyway, see, you could go. Okay, we're showing a slide where Grant Affleck is on the stand, and he testifies on the. Grant Affleck now is feeling really betrayed by Paul Dunn. He thought Paul Dunn, because Paul Dunn would feel guilty that he threw Grant Affleck under the bus to take the full blame for this fraud, that somehow Paul Dunn would come forward, testify at the trial, and save him from being prosecuted. And he was really saddened and bitter when that didn't happen. Paul Dunn was given an assignment by the church to be, if not out of the state, out of the country during the trial, to make sure that he wasn't going to be called to testify. But anyway, because Affleck was burned, he testified that Paul Dunn was with the company up until the end. That was his testimony. And of course, that eliminated his being charged. That eliminated his being charged, that one count that he lied about Paul Dunn being active in the company, because they wouldn't call Paul Dunn to testify, to prove otherwise. So that got rid of that count, but he was really bitter over that, as was his family, being hung out to dry by a general authority like that. And then he was convicted. I have to look at my version of the slides to see.
And I'm just going to say, while you're looking at that this is another, you said that Paul Dunn was asked to be out of the country. Is that right?
I don't think he asked. I think the church, this would have been something arranged by Jim Jardine. They would have said, we need to be sure. See, Affleck's attorney, Brent Carruth, was threatening to call Paul Dunn. He was trying to force Paul Dunn to make some kind of a statement or something that would rescue his client. And Brent Carruth, his attorney, was sort of a loose cannon. He might have done it. And my guess is, and I don't know this, it's just a wild guess, that Jim Jardine told general authorities, this trial is going on. Paul Dunn could be called. We need to make sure he can't be called. And so he was not in Utah during this phase of the trial.
Yeah, and that's a technique that we have now learned that the church has used since time immemorial, whether it's sending B.H. Roberts on a mission once he uncovers that the Book of Mormon is not a historical document, whether it's sending Ezra Taft Benson to Europe. I know about.
I won't name names, but I was working on another fraud story that as the investigators got close, the church sent him on a mission.
And sometimes even as mission presidents, like it's not even just like as a lowly missionary. Sometimes they'll send people embroiled in scandals as mission presidents out of the state.
And this case I'm telling you about, he was made a mission president. He was very wealthy, well known. But if you then go to the next slide, it's just something I dropped in there about the fact that Laura Siegler was over Utah Securities Division, was obviously involved in this prosecution, and she acknowledged the obvious. We were under substantial political pressure not to proceed against Paul Dunn. And of course, that's what eventually happened.
So this shows how the church and politicians use their money and influence to suppress cases.
Yeah. And we're getting, and we'll be getting to an interesting part of the story pretty soon. Why don't you go to the next slide? I'm just looking over here as to what comes up. This is part of the tragedy, is that Paul Dunn, once he knew that a story was going to come out, and once he knew that AFCO probably was going to go under, started demanding he had invested some money in AFCO. Now, the primary way that he was compensated for being on the board of directors and lending his name to promoting it was being given a new car either every year or every other year. And I think he had a Cadillac Eldorado. I think he had a Mercedes. AFCO was providing this because Grant Affleck was in the car business before he got into AFCO. He was a well-known, bountiful car dealer and did a lot of leases. And so he leases and pays for these vehicles, these Mercedes and that for Paul Dunn. But he had invested some money, and as soon as he sees it's going under, and this is probably the worst part of it, is instead of going to Affleck and saying, you have got to get money back to these people who are losing their homes, he said, I want my money. I want to be paid. And he was always pressuring him to get money. And this is an example of one of the checks he got late on after he knew a story was coming out, but the story had not come out, would have been just probably a little after the time he had talked to Spence Kennard, and he was getting checks. And I just threw in an example of one of those.
And to me, it's a little bit extra gross because it's one thing to be perpetrating, part of using undue influence to get people to invest in something. But then when you know that people are losing their shirts, you demand to get your money back, and, too bad for everybody else, right? Yeah,
he was not Mr. Nice Guy when it came to that. In Grant Affleck's view, he throws Affleck under the bus and then tries to get what money out of it he can before the ship sinks. And so the next slide just is another example of him getting involved in business. And this is where Gerald Wingett, his son-in-law, was a ball player, an athlete, and Wingett's sons were good athletes. And so Paul Dunn identified with Gerald Wingett, and they did a lot of business ventures together. And when Gerald Wingett opened a Jiffy Lube, I think in Provo, he has Paul Dunn come as a general authority and meet Paul Dunn at the grand opening of this Jiffy Lube and have him autograph one of your books.
This is a flyer that you've got on the screen of a Jiffy Lube promotion. This was using Paul Dunn.
I think this was in either the Provo Daily Herald or the BYU's Daily Universe, a paper you're very familiar with.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now we could go on forever talking about this, but I think the baseball and war is what starts getting interesting. So if this slide is the beginning of a brief overview of his baseball career. And this is a shot of Paul Dunn. He's with a bat and he's playing sandlot baseball in Arkansas. And this is, I think, behind his house, but it's behind one of the neighbors' houses. So he was like me when I was growing up. We were always playing sandlot baseball and even tackle football, anywhere we could find a place to play it. His family was not very active in Little Rock. They were LDS, but it was out in, the mission field. They were not very active during this time frame. Then the next picture.
Well, what I have now is one of the talks that Dunn gives. And this is the first time now our listening audience is going to actually hear him talk. And I think this is the Lou Gehrig story. And I want to put it here to give you a sense for his charisma, his charm, his storytelling. but also so you can contrast the difference between the stories he told and then the evidence, Lynn Packer, that you investigated. Is that all right?
Sure.
All right, everyone. So here is Paul H. Dunn, I believe, telling his famous Lou Gehrig story.
The next morning, the Yankees were due at 9, and I was there at 6. We went through the same ritual. This time, I was asked to shag balls behind the batting practice pitcher so he wouldn't have to bend over so far in throwing baseballs into practice. Red Ruffing, another Hall of Famer, was on the mound. And he had a vocabulary that was kind of interesting for a 12-year-old. And about the 5th batter into the batting cage that morning was Gehrig. And my heart beat a little faster as he stepped in. And as he walked up after knocking the dirt out of his cleats, he stood there and he adjusted his cap. And he looks out to his friend, Ruffing, and he says, "Hey, Red, let that kid behind you pitch to me." And I went, and Red didn't want to. He said, "Oh, I want to get through, Lou, and take a shower." And Gehrig just stood there. He said, "I said, let the boy pitch." Ruffing turned and said, "Here, kid. You ladies may not know it, but a baseball only weighs about 5.5 ounces. But it felt like a 16-pound shot put." I walked up on the mound. I'm 60 feet, 6 inches from my idol. I don't know who yours is in life, but think of him or her and be in that close proximity. He could see I was concerned. I was feeling very inferior. He took that magnificent bat and he just held it there, and then he pushed it out like this. He said, "Just aim at the bat, son." And I threw the ball somewhere in the park. Then I got one reasonably close, and he hit a little ground ball back to me. And then he hit another one. Then he hit a short pop fly over second. Then about the 4th or 5th pitch, he let go. The right field wall at Little Rock is 395 feet, and the ball just tailed out. Then he hit another one right behind it, and a third. And I'm feeling a little better because I'm getting the ball close. I wind up, how hard can a 12-year-old throw? And I just grooved that pitch. He took that mighty Gehrig swing, and he missed. And he stood up and he said, "Beautiful." And I remember growing on the mound. And I remember thinking, "Look out, world, I'm coming."
Oh, it's so emotional to see him tell stories like that, right?
Right. And it never happened. I went to great pains to do the research to see what professional, and there were pro teams barnstorming through Little Rock, but that's just, it never happened.
Right. And he's so, you can tell he's told that story, what, dozens, hundreds of times, maybe even thousands of times. And he's got it down to such detail, right?
Yeah. When he first started appearing at firesides in Southern California around Los Angeles, he would usually tell all of these stories in the same fireside, war stories, baseball stories. And then eventually he learns how to give a speech and only give one or two. BYU had some fantastic resources. So I was able to find a speech that he gave well before he was a general authority in Southern California. And it was just packed with these stories. And he probably had given them dozens of times before he ever was promoted and came to Salt Lake.
So Diane asks, did Lou Gehrig ever hear this story?
No, but he did tell a Ted Williams story that also, by all accounts, was false. But Ted Williams was still alive, and I made a great effort to interview Ted Williams, but his publicist never set it up. It's a story about whether Williams got some interest in the church because of Paul Dunn. But again, that's one that's in the book with what information I was able to learn about it. Certainly would not have happened. It's the thing about this is all of his significant war stories and baseball stories were all made up. There wasn't like one that he could say this really happened. So once he started to lie, he just decided, okay, and he needed lots of stories. That's why he parceled them out. It made him a more interesting speaker, unlike some others who lie, but it's just one story and they just have to keep telling the same one over and over. Right. The next slide shows him at Hollywood High in the yearbook, good-looking kid, and he was big. I barely 6 foot in high school and grew 3 inches after high school. Paul Dunn was one of those who got his height, and I think he was pretty tall early. So he was a big guy. And I think the next slide shows, yeah, it does. This is his high school baseball team. It says Hollywood on it because he went to Hollywood High. Meb Schroeder was the coach, and he uses Schroeder's name in some of his stories, and he was a pitcher. And I only was able to talk to 2 or 3 people and see some news accounts of Paul Dunn pitching. And unfortunately, he was what you might call a junk ball pitcher. He had a curve. He may have had a slider. He may have had a changeup from a curve, which means going from slow to really slow. He had no fastball. And you would expect somebody that big to have a really good fastball, but as near as I can tell, he had no fastball. And that's one of the reasons he didn't advance, is that if you're going to move up to collegiate ball or in the minor leagues, you've got to have the full palette of pitchers, with some exceptions. There's been some screwball pitchers, some who have never had a fastball, but that's extremely, extremely rare. Then if you go to the next one, is you can see how tall Paul Dunn was compared with his dad and his brothers. He's a big guy, they're small guys. And they all worked in the family grocery store. And that's where Paul Dunn would have spent a lot of his time, is working in his dad's store. And of course, and I think by time Paul Dunn was in college, his dad had a couple of stores. That was the business he was in. It was in selling food. Is that he had decided he didn't want to take over the stores. He wanted to become an educator or an administrator. He must have enjoyed seminary. And like I said earlier, a friend of mine took one of his seminary classes and said he was very entertaining. He probably was really very popular with the students. Because remember, his stories about war and baseball were more contemporary at that time. Now it's distant past World War II. Back then, it was recent past. The next slide shows.
Let's show one more.
Oh yeah.
Let's show another clip before we have you talk about the next part. Is that okay?
Now, which one is this?
It's another baseball one. It's yeah. It's another baseball one. I'm not sure which one it is, but I think it's in sequence.
All right.
All right. I'll go ahead and start it.
When I was a younger teenager, wanting to pursue the athletic field, I was moving along with relative ease and with some accomplishment. The time came when I signed a professional contract. Unfortunately, the world conditions were much more serious than they are now. The whole world was engaged in a conflict. and then the enemy struck us, it became necessary that year to lower the draft to 18. And I turned 18 the very month they lowered it. Now, how's that for timing? They had a big drawing in Washington to see which number would go first. Do I need to tell you whose number they picked? And instead of going into my great field of desire, I end up going into the military.
And you talk about this in your book and in your Sunstone article, that the facts don't substantiate basically anything you said. Is that right?
No, what happened is he never did get that contract. Is a lot of his classmates were enlisting. They wanted to go to war. It was the popular thing to do. He had his heart so set on a baseball career that instead of enlisting, he went to Pocatello, Idaho, where he had relatives living, and tried to walk on with the Pocatello Cardinals, which was a St. Louis Cardinal farm team. But I think he got his draft notice maybe while he was in Pocatello, but it came fairly soon. And of course, his hopes and dreams were dashed because of going into the military. And then I don't have any slides here to show it, but when he was drafted and was assigned before being shipped off to the Pacific, he was stationed at a base in Michigan, where he played a season or a short season for one of the base's baseball teams. Baseball was really popular in the community he was in, so the local players would play against the military players. And because some professional baseball players had been drafted, there were some pro players playing in that league. And so at this point, Paul Dunn does get some experience pitching against pro baseball players, but it was in the military. It's really sort of a pathetic, sad story, because he writes home saying that he had won certain awards pitching for this military team, awards that he never won. He was really hungry for praise, for adulation, but he would make it up. He was making it up even before he was shipped off to the Pacific. Like, I won, it's in the book, but he won some award, and he writes home, he's all excited about it. It's just simply not true.
Here's the next video we have. This is another one that you gave me, also talking about baseball. I'll play it real quick.
On my 18th birthday, I signed a professional baseball contract. Was sent up here into the Pioneer League. I won my first ball game 7-1. And that was a proud moment. Walked off the field, and the coach on the opposing team said, in kind of a sneery voice, "Hey, kid, whoever said you could pitch?" And I looked right at him and I said, "Gehrig."
All right. Tell us what's the truthometer on that one?
It's been a long time since I've reviewed my book, but what I think it says is that he did win a couple of games in this
When I was
in the military league. And I think one that he won was 7-1. And so probably in his mind, he's talking about that game and transposing it to a professional minor league game in Pocatello, Idaho. But you can imagine, even during the season that this competition was taking place on his base up in Michigan, the players were coming and going. You might have a great player on a team and be headed for the playoffs, and then you lose that player and your team falls apart. It's been my experience playing on a lot of church and commercial league basketball teams, that every team that's successful has to have at least one star that you build the team around. And obviously I was never that star, but I played with a lot of players who were really good. And when you didn't have that player, you didn't win. And I think that's what happened in Dunn's league is some of their good players came and went. And he certainly was not, even though he may have won a couple of games, he wasn't their best pitcher, and he wasn't a star in the league.
Right.
At least in the news accounts that I reviewed.
So tell us about this article.
This is just typical of where he will take a photograph and give it to, in this case, the church news, and try and
read the headline to our listeners.
Baseball honors Elder Paul Dunn. And this is where...
This is in 1976, it looks like.
Yeah. And this is just typical where he gives them facts that aren't true, and then he uses this photo saying that this particular photo shows Paul Dunn and some other players with an actor kneeling with the team, and it was Robert Young, who was very well known in the late 50s and early 60s for a television show, I think it was called, was it Father Knows Best or something? It was one of these family sitcoms, and he was very well known, a very well known actor. And for some reason, he was with this group. And Paul Dunn has it as being with the Hollywood Stars, a Cardinal farm team, but that's not the Hollywood Stars. And the church news didn't vet it. Now, I did find out that at one point, a reporter, somebody who wrote for the church news, was on to Paul Dunn making up stories. And I think
somebody said that's Marcus Welby.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. I think it was Marcus Welby, but I think there was an earlier one too. But for sure, Marcus Welby. And but in any event, he is making this stuff up. A reporter for the church news figures it out, and so the church news had the opportunity at that time to expose what was going on, and chose not to. Chose just to continue letting Paul Dunn tell the stories, sell the books.
Yeah, the Mormon church does not come clean and tell the truth when it's caught in lies or dishonesty. It does the opposite. It tries to hide it or deny it or push it under.
Right.
It just doesn't. It doesn't tell the truth.
Yeah,
when it's confronted with
as we see, because we're still not quite to the really interesting part of this, so we ought to run through a little bit of the war in baseball.
Let's do it. So now we're at the war part.
The war part, and this is the only photo that I was ever able to find or get. I'm sure Paul Dunn had lots of them, but would not share them, of him actually in the service. I don't know if this is on Okinawa or where it is. He's very sloppily dressed as a soldier, but I can tell you from having served in Vietnam, we didn't pay that close attention to being always look like we're ready to be in a parade either, because you're in a war zone. And he was. And so going to the next slide.
Really? Oh, okay, go ahead.
I'm just mirroring here on my computer your slides. Is that one of the two most important stories he tells about being in the war is the landing at Guam.
Should I play that?
He was.
Should I play it, or do you want to set it up?
Set it up, and then
Okay.
you can play it. He was in the 77th Division. It was a New York division, but as the war soldiered on, they would pull recruits from other parts of the country to be in this New York division. And you see here soldiers from the New York 77th wading ashore. And this is where Paul Dunn describes pushing past dead bodies in the clip that you'll play right now.
Okay. Here we go. This is Paul H. Dunn telling the story about his landing on Guam.
First boat team starts in. They've got about 2,000 yards. This is when the tide is at its height, so you can get as far ashore as you possibly can. Well, the first boat team went about 1,200 yards before they hit the shore. The whole beach opened up. We don't know how anybody could stay alive. And one craft after the other was hit, and it was scattering American soldiers in the water. Second flare goes off. Next boat goes in. Same thing. Third, fourth, fifth, sixth. Nobody's getting ashore. Makes you ponder and wonder. Now it comes time for the seventh wave, and that's mine. Flare goes off, and in goes the boat team. And it's just kind of eerie sitting there watching that boat go up and down. You can see the palm trees getting a little bigger. Your heart's pounding. Then all of a sudden, the whole shoreline opens up, zeroing in on you. Now it's H-hour +1. The tide's starting to come out. It exposes the large coral reef, and our LCVP can't get over it. It sticks on the coral reef, and the Navy gets excited. They drop the front and say, "Get out of here, you're drawing fire." We jump in the water's chest high. You got to hold your rifle over your head. Muzzle drops in the water. That's salt water. It'll blow up on you when you fire. Did you ever try to run in water up to your chest, loaded down? You don't move very fast. And the enemy starts to pick you up. And you're pushing with the butt of your rifle the dead bodies and wounded bodies of your friends and associates you've been training with. The coral is so sharp, it cuts the boots off your feet, and your feet are starting to bleed like mincemeat, and you're trying to get ashore. And I was one of the first ashore that morning, and I dug my first foxhole with my fingernails, and I crawled in it. And just as I crawled into that mucky hole, an ambu gun opened up. It shoots about 700 rounds a minute, and it went down my right arm and took off my identification bracelet. And I rolled over and started to talk to Heavenly Father. And he answered me.
See that? There's the hook. You have the charismatic, articulate, interesting, general authority voice telling you this inspiring story. You feel inspired, and then they make that connection that the church is true, or God lives, or prayer works.
The God had preserved his life because he had a mission which carries over to other stories that he told. Of course, there wasn't nothing remotely close happened that he describes. Is that the 77th Division was new in going into the Pacific. And what they often would do is have an experienced combat team hit first. And the Marines hit first at Guam, who had seen action on other islands. And they did meet some resistance, nothing like he describes. They met some. And so by time the 77th Division landed, it was totally unopposed. And I think the only one soldier in the 77th who got killed was run over by a Jeep on the shore, and he was killed.
Right. Yeah. All right. So tell us about this photo of Douglas MacArthur.
Another of Paul Dunn's stories is that he was made part of a special cadre that was going to land at the Philippines before MacArthur. This is not unusual that if you have a particular kind of landing, especially one highly publicized like MacArthur coming, is you're going to have some people ashore first to prepare the way. And so Dunn said, I was there before MacArthur and prepared the way. He's sort of like a Forrest Gump. He takes something that's well known and then he places it in the middle of that action. And of course, that's not true at all. And if you go to the next slide, is that Hal Sperry was, I guess, a friend of Dunn's who served in the Philippines. And when the Arizona Republic decided that they wanted to consider running my story, is that they came to Salt Lake and interviewed Paul Dunn in Salt Lake. And Jim Jardine was there, and Rick Iyer was there too, giving support. And they came up with a new document. They came up with some new proof that Dunn had served in action in the Philippines. And it was supplied by this Hal Sperry. And they did this interview over the Christmas break in 1990. And I'd been teaching in Germany, but I came home for Christmas. And they timed it this way. So they would do the interview. And as soon as the reporter did the interview, he came to my home and said, "Hey, we've got this new proof from Hal Sperry." So I took a day or two to investigate. And indeed, Hal Sperry was in the Philippines, but he wasn't anywhere near Paul Dunn's unit. And so I called Hal Sperry while I was there on the phone and asked him about that and said, "You couldn't have been there. I did research and it doesn't look like that you were there." And he admitted, he said, "Well, I could have been." He said, "Paul Dunn called me, said he was in some trouble, needed somebody to vouch for what he did. And so I did this." So you had him lying in order to help cover up Paul Dunn's lie. And of course, I reported this back and gave Arizona Republic this information before I went back to Germany. And for some reason, my camera is...
Yeah, go ahead and just keep making the change that you normally do. While you're doing that, I'm just going to say that one of the things that's really hard to just accept, you grow up just loving the church and thinking of it as a parent and thinking that these people talk to God and that they represent Jesus and that they're the most loving, ethical, kind people in the world. And you give them the benefit of the doubt that there's no way that they would ever lie or deceive or intimidate or harm anybody, and then, Gordon B. Hinckley goes in front of Larry King and says that polygamy is not doctrinal, or, says that we don't emphasize, or, that we don't teach that God was once a man, and you give them all the benefit of the doubt because you love them and they're like grandparents and you believe they would never intentionally lie. But when you learn about these stories behind the scenes, you learn that they systematically lie and deceive and will do anything to protect their assets, their money, their power, and their reputation. And it's systemic. It's systemic.
They went all in on it. And if you move to the next slide, I'm moving cameras back and forth. You can see my other camera in the shot. It's sort of funny. But anyway, the clincher is I finally tracked down Harold Brown. The story
about that story. I wanted to find video of that and I couldn't find it.
Yeah, the story of Harold Brown is Harold Brown was his friend all the way through. And Harold was a religious, very religious individual. The two stuck together because both of them had higher standards than other soldiers that they were with. And so they had a great affection for each other. And so Paul Dunn tells the story where one night they're on the perimeter, they've dug in foxholes, they expect an enemy attack. The enemy attack comes. There's a lot of shots exchanged between the Japanese and them. It's a vicious firefight that takes place. But the rule is that during the firefight and until it's all over, you can't move foxholes. You've got to stay where you are and protect your position. And so Paul Dunn, at first light, moves over to Harold Brown's foxhole, which was adjacent, and he's all shot up. He's suffered multiple gunshot wounds. He takes him in his arms. Harold Brown is dying, and Harold Brown says, "Promise me one thing," something to the effect that if you survive this, that you will minister to the youth or something, sort of like to the youth of your church. And that's the story. And he tells this over and over again. It took me quite a while to track him down. It was harder, much harder in those days without the internet. So I finally call him on the phone. He tells me the true story. He's aware that Paul Dunn is telling the story. He has since talked to Paul Dunn and visited with him in, I think, St. Louis after the story, and just goes along with it. And he's the one who mailed me the photo that shows him and Paul Dunn standing together. he agreed to help with that. And so I scanned it and then I sent it back. Then later, as I'm still working on the book and I'm still at BYU, I'm at a conference in Kansas City, and I make arrangements to go to his house. And so you see the shot of me at Harold Brown's house. As we discuss it further, we'd already had several conversations on the phone. My wife waited outside in the car along with one of my colleagues from one of the German television stations. And I first went inside the house before I came out to talk to him, and his wife was there. And he told me that on more than one occasion, Mormon missionaries would track him out. And he would say, "I'm Harold Brown." And they'd say, "Well, all the missionaries knew this story. You're the Harold Brown in the Paul Dunn stories?" "Yeah, I'm here. I'm alive." And we talked about it further. And then suddenly his wife blurts out that he's still very religious. There's Bibles, at least one and maybe two, sitting on the stands there. And his wife blurts out, says, "Harold, you know that was wrong. You know what he was doing is wrong." She was indignant about it, but he went along. I think he may have enjoyed the fact that he was good friends with Paul Dunn, and his story was being told, even though it was not true.
And just so that people understand exactly the story, and now I'm reading from the Sunstone article, but this is also in your book. I'll just read this a bit. Dunn tells the story of how his unit dug in near Chocolate Drop Hill. Normally, he and Harold Brown shared a foxhole, but this night their ranks were so depleted that the two occupied individual foxholes about 50 yards apart. At about 11 p.m., Brown's hole took a direct mortar hit. Dunn says he could not go to his rescue because of a rule against leaving foxholes at night. All Dunn could do is endure the night, listening to Brown's moans. At daybreak, Dunn rushed to his companion's side, finding him alive but bleeding from 67 shrapnel wounds. Somebody counted them. Brown, barely clinging to life, said, "Paul, I know this is the end." As Dunn took him in his arms, Brown made two requests. First, he wanted his mother assured he had been faithful to the end to the principles she taught him. And then this is quoting, "And he said, 'Paul, the second thing I'd appreciate your doing,' and he could hardly talk. I had to bend down to hear him. 'If you ever have an opportunity to talk to the young people of America, will you tell them for me that it's a privilege to lay down my life for them?' And with that testimony on his lips, he died." And what you're saying is this guy never died, and you visited him and hung out with him at his house. Is that right?
It's a great story. When the story broke, I was in Germany, but I'd already made arrangements and sold part of my research to Channel 2. And as I understand it, they flew back and interviewed Harold Brown. I never did see it, and I never did track it down. But that I call it the clincher, because then it's pretty dramatic, and Dunn would make excuses. "Oh, I just used his name. It really happened, but I didn't want to use the name of the soldier it really happened with." Dunn, for all the research I did, never saw any action. He was usually behind the lines. Most soldiers didn't see any action. They would participate as backup or in one way or another. And Dunn had a reputation of being sort of from one soldier who I talked to who knew him, and maybe he wasn't telling the truth, but he had a reputation of being sort of a pansy, as somebody who, easily could go to sick call or wanted to get out of one bit of drudgery, one assignment after another. But there's just nothing that he ever was actually under enemy fire, other than even if you're behind the lines, maybe sometime there's some sort of, I don't know if they had artillery, I don't think so, but some sort of attack that way. But then if you go
So there's no real evidence that he ever even saw meaningful combat at all.
No, he would have seen lots of people who had died, as I did when I was in Vietnam. Never saw any combat whatsoever. I was at bases that were under rocket attack, but that's not combat. But I saw on several occasions dead soldiers or dying soldiers. That was common, because even if you're in a base like I was, that's not a forward base, is that these injured and dead are being brought back to the rear, where they're being treated, or if they're dead, being shipped out, shipped to Saigon and then back to the States. But going to the next slide begins to deal with what happens after I do this research and I'm trying to do the story and it still hasn't come out. And if you go to the next one, oh, well, this one just says that Paul Dunn complained to Jay Balloff, who was an administrator at BYU just under President Holland, and was complaining about my research. This is the time I first find out that Paul Dunn and Boyd never got along, because Dunn and his family start complaining that Boyd Packer put me up to this, that he's getting even for something. That's the first I'd heard that the two were at odds.
And I have to say this, that I even have a friend who told me to ask you about this. There are people that still love Paul Dunn, that still say, who cares if he told some fibs? He did good. He inspired people, and they tend to be defensive. And this dear friend of mine told me to, asked me to ask you this, because I think it might even be his belief to this day that Boyd K. Packer and other general authorities were just jealous of Paul H. Dunn's fame and money and influence. And so Boyd K. Packer used you as a stooge to take down Paul H. Dunn because they were jealous of what he was doing.
Well, I could see where other general authority, hell, I would be. If I were a general authority and somebody was packing them in and everywhere they go, it's standing room only and they're with all these stars, I would feel some jealousy myself. But I can tell you this, at no time did any general authority, especially my uncle, say, do this story. And with my uncle, with Boyd, it was the opposite. Don't do it. It's not going to do you or the church any good. Don't do it. It was exactly the opposite. It just simply,
and the tips didn't come from church leadership.
No. As we'll get into here in a couple of minutes, as we get into how the church begins to investigate this, because on the next slide, it shows Jay Balloff. If you pull that one up.
Yeah.
It shows Jay Balloff and Paul Dunn together. They were friends. They were both very much into sports. And so there's just so much detail about everything that went on over a period of more than a year as I'm trying to finish the story, and I'm being threatened with being fired. But finally, in the end, Paul Dunn complains to Jay Balloff, says he's still investigating me, still trying to do a story. So Jay Balloff calls me in to his office at BYU and sort of reads the riot act. He doesn't want to hear anything about war and baseball stories. He says it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if it's not true. We will not take accusations against a general authority to the media. And I tried to explain to him, I am a reporter. I report while I freelance, and I work for KSL while I teach. That didn't matter. He didn't care a whit about journalism. And then but what I did agree to, one thing that they did say is, if you want to have an outside chance at keeping your job, and I was in the middle of a semester and I wanted to, they said, you've got to take this information to the church. At least you have a duty as a Mormon, not as a journalist, to take this to church authorities. And to make peace, And to keep my life from being totally disrupted at that time, I said, okay, I will. And so they set it up. And you see the next slide is that I went to they set up the meeting. If you can pull up the next slide.
Sorry. There you go.
They set up the meeting, and I remember that they first told me Boyd was aware of the meeting, but he wanted to stay out of it, and rightfully so. And so they told me, first go to your uncle's office. And I did. He knew why I was there. And he walked me down the hall. And I remember passing Dallin Oaks as we walked down the hall. This is at 47 East South Temple. And Elders Faust and Haight were there ready to talk. And they were more than understanding and gracious. This was completely different from my meeting with Balaf. Balaf was venomous. He was just a total hard ass in the meeting, demeaning. Why are you doing this against a general? You don't do it. You're a bad guy. You're a bad citizen of BYU. These guys were not like that at all. They were sympathetic, and they expected me to be sympathetic to their plight. And the point that they made is so many people came into the church, this would be so disruptive. But they didn't have all the facts, and they were rather startled when I told them that none of the stories was true. They had not heard that. They had their suspicions over the years. So they asked me this. They said, would you be willing to let our investigator, somebody we assign, look into this? And I said, sure, why not? And so what they did is they assigned an attorney who had retired but was working for the church in one of the departments, who was a known really good attorney, to do this. And they said, will you meet with him? And we met in Salt Lake. And I brought him just a stack of documents and said, these are the issues, and here's the proof that I've got. His name was Harry Pugsley.
And by the way, we've interviewed his grandson, Mark Pugsley, on Mormon Stories podcast.
Oh.
Mark is an attorney in Utah that focuses on fraud.
Yeah.
And, so shout out to Mark Pugsley.
And Harry was very professional, like many attorneys, and he approached it as an attorney. Let's see if there's proof. Let's see if there's not. And he investigated for some time. And at one point, he got back to me, and he had the courtesy of doing this because he didn't have to, and said, Lynn, I've checked out your stuff, and it all checks out. And I'm reporting that back to Elders Faust and Haight.
So he was a good guy.
Yeah.
All right, Mark, your grandpa's a good guy, apparently.
Yeah. And so then they initiated the meeting. I was called back into another meeting with Elders Faust and Haight. And we discussed the fact that they had shown that they now were convinced that this was pretty bad and that something needed to be done. And they said, what we're doing is we're making him emeritus. And I said, why isn't he being fired and made an example of? And why doesn't the churches? And they came out and said, we're concerned about all the people who have been converted based on Paul Dunn. And I told them I disagreed with it, but I fully understood that. And then they said, are you now satisfied that we're making him emeritus? And I said, well, what does that have to do with anything? And they said, well, now that he's being essentially given the boot, do you plan to continue to do the story? And I said, yeah, that whether you kept him or fired him or whatever you did had nothing to do with my story. That was not my goal. My goal as a reporter is to present the facts. And then if you want to use the facts and take some sort of action or not take action, then that's your choice. That's the way journalism works. And so that's the way it ended. Remember, the story hasn't broken, and the story only breaks that he's given emeritus status. And so I continue working on the story. Paul Dunn knows I'm continuing to work on the story. And then I think it comes up to another slide where now it really hits the fan that I'm continuing, despite the fact he's been given emeritus status. And Gordon Whiting had been made department chairman over the communications department. He was not a journalist, but he was aware, as of everybody in the department, that this controversy was going on. Everybody in the department knew I'd been researching this over a period of years, that I was trying to get the story published, that Uncle Boyd had told me on 2 occasions that I know of to quit and not do it. But I was still persisting. And Gordon Whiting initially called me in and said, "We are behind you. We are teaching journalism here. And if this is true, this is a story that should come out." And that was Gordon Whiting's position. But as the pressure continued, and as Balluff continued to push for me to be fired, and you go to the next.
Can I just say how horrible that is, that the church is threatening you to hide a story under penalty of firing you for telling the truth about someone committing massive fraud to the general membership in the world? That is so heinous that they would not only try and hide the story, but threaten to fire you. It's outrageous.
Yeah, and in essence, the firing was not renewing my contract, which is a firing.
That's firing.
And I was on a committee where they rated classes in our department, because we were getting ready to get rid of some classes and combine some others. The 2 classes I taught, and I taught exclusively, were top rated. We're at the very top. And I think both because of the effectiveness and importance of the class, and I think I was just a damn good teacher. And so they were taking one of the best teachers in the department, saying, if you don't back off this, you're going to get the axe. So if you go to the next slide, is another amazing turn in this story, is Gordon Whiting sent me an email and or a memo, I think it was. Didn't have email back then because I didn't have a computer in my office. Some of the others did. Is that he sent me a memo, and he had done a 180. What he said is I was in the temple this morning and realized that I should not be supporting you. And in the memo, he said, in my judgment, the publication of the Paul Dunn article will damage the church, will damage the university, will damage the department, and will damage you. And that ended my career at BYU. He's the one that had the authority to either offer me another contract or terminate my work there. And so it was over. He was their hit guy, so to speak.
So they fired you.
Yeah. So he went to the temple, and that's when, and I've already told you the story, that after this happened, I make immediate, I go to immediate effort to try and teach in Germany, and I was successful at doing it. So it was a very quick transition from BYU to the university.
And did the media cover your firing? Did the Salt Lake Tribune or the Deseret News or Sunstone or anyone, or the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, like, why wasn't it that the world, or at least the country, if not the state, if not the church membership, were, because I remember this happening. Why wasn't everyone outraged and like picketing? This is horrible.
The only time is the AP told this story in the most depth, but was after the story broke. This was months later. Everybody knew I was working on the story. I had pitched it everywhere. I was trying to freelance the story. I was not working at KSL. I was freelancing, and I was freelancing for Utah Holiday, and it's the first and only story I pitched to them that they turned down. They said, this is just too hot. We can't do it. And I went and see, UPI came close to doing this story. UPI is a wire service like AP, Associated Press. They had really good reporters, and they had a reporter, Pete Gillens, who had reported on the AFCO fraud, so he knew all about Paul Dunn. And they initially agreed to take the story, and I submitted it. And of course, I let Jim Jardine know, which was a mistake. was a mistake to be open and honest about who might do the story. And so what Jim Jardine did is he flew back to New York, met with the president of UPI, and he took a stack of Paul Dunn books and said, how could this be accurate? How could all these stories and all these books over so many years be lies? And I think he also threatened them, as he had threatened me, with a libel suit. And immediately after his visit, they pulled the plug and said, we're not going to do this story. It's too hot. We're not going to do it. And so
is Jim Jardine still alive?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I later, during my career working as a consultant, worked on the Caldera Microsoft case. And I know you used to work for Microsoft, I think. And I was on the other side. I was on Caldera's side. Sorry about that.
No problem.
And he was on Microsoft's side. And so I had not direct dealings with him, but indirectly I dealt with a lot of what he was doing as the fight goes back and forth, as the litigation proceeds.
So another question I have is, why didn't your uncle rescue you? Why didn't he save you from getting fired? Why didn't he stop this and say, hey, this is dishonest. I'm a special witness of Christ. I'm an apostle of the Lord. This general authority is being dishonest, and this story is true. And I'm certainly not going to let the church excommunicate my nephew for doing his job as a journalist, which is why we hired him at BYU, and for telling the truth. Why didn't your uncle have your back?
I think it would have been a disaster. I think it would have made the situation worse. It was already a powder keg.
Did you ask him to intervene? Did you tell him what was going on?
And I wouldn't. And I would expect him, if he heard about it, to not intervene. I saw it as my business. I'm the one, as I use the race car analogy, that's taking it right to the edge, trying to not go over. And in effect, I went over the edge, and you suffer the consequences. Yeah. Now, whether he could have done something behind the scenes or not, whether I got tossed to the wolves, I don't know. I sort of doubt it, but it's just something I don't know. I don't know what was going on by then at church headquarters, because in the stretch leading up to my being kicked out of BYU, it was all going on at BYU. I don't even know that they knew about it. And I didn't tell them. I didn't call and plead for my job. I figured if they're going to take it, they're going to take it.
I just received a message from a friend telling me that Jim Jardine also represented Russell M. Nelson's daughter and son-in-law in a pretty significant sexual abuse scandal that has been ongoing for quite some time. So he must be a fix-it man for the church. Well, in several different ways.
Well, clearly he was with the Paul Dunn thing. I don't even know who paid his salary or paid him, or if he was paid at all. It may have been voluntary. I don't know that.
Then we have a listener who asks, was Jim related to Doug Jardine, prominent newscaster excommunicated for cheating with an intern?
I've never heard about any of that. I don't know if he was related. I have no idea.
Okay.
I don't know. But if you sort of moving on to
next slide.
The next slide is in 1990, a year before his confession, Paul Dunn starts getting involved in other business activities, like he's involved with the Values Institute, where
Values Institute.
where they're teaching values of Christianity and honesty and integrity. And I wrote about this at some point. I can't remember if I put anything in the book. Maybe I did, maybe it didn't. I don't remember. And then the next slide gets to where I've approached the Arizona Republic right near the time I left BYU. They start looking at it. They start doing research. And then finally, they break my story. And the Associated Press knew it was going to be broken. I was in contact with the Associated Press, helping them out, because they knew that once somebody broke the story, then they could break it. And so they were all prepared to do it. And I was in, like I said, I was in Germany at the time, communicating mostly by fax with the Arizona Republic and with AP. And I'd already been pre-interviewed to some extent by the AP when I was home over the holidays, because there was the possibility it was going to break in December. And then it just took a little bit longer than they thought to break. Then,
and let me just be clear, the Salt Lake Tribune and the Deseret News, neither would cover this story.
They would not cover it, but they once it was broken in the Arizona Republic, all of the local media did stories. And for a day,
they wouldn't break the story.
Pardon?
They wouldn't break the story.
Oh, no. I tried. I tried every which way to get somebody to publish it and failed repeatedly. Like I said, even with Utah Holiday, and I'd won awards for Utah Holiday, they'd never turned down a story. They knew it was a hot story. It was too hot.
I've never heard of Utah Holiday.
It was a respected publication that did a lot of good reporting and then just went under. It just didn't make it.
Yeah, just last year there was this story that came out of the Stephen Murdoch guy, the bishop, the Mormon bishop and stake high councilman, who was a peeping Tom and taking pictures of women in their dressing rooms and he had sexually abused several people in his workplace, and he was a sitting stake high counselor, and he had been a former bishop. And while he was a bishop, he had sexually abused several people. I took that to the Salt Lake Tribune last year, and they had zero interest in breaking the story.
Oh yeah, that's the Tribune has just plummeted in stature. The state of journalism, in Salt Lake, don't get me started. It's certainly at an all-time low, and there's no end in sight. It's going to continue.
It's just going to get worse.
Yeah. So the next slide shows what happened is that in October of 91, this is after the story breaks, Paul Dunn was required to put an open letter to members of the church in the church news. I did not know that this was coming. And again, I was in Germany. This time I had begun consulting and I was working on a project up in Hamburg and got a call in the middle of the night from a reporter saying, "Have you heard about this? We want your comment." And in the letter, Paul Dunn says, "I confess that I've not always been accurate in my public talks and writings." It was a lame admission that something happened. But the interesting part is, furthermore, I've indulged in other activities inconsistent with the high and sacred office which I have held. And then, and so there was, he had done something that had attracted their attention that caused them to do this. And before I finish this part of the story, I just wanted to introduce in the next slide the fact of and we're sort of going long, so I'm not going to spend much time on this, just other than if you go to the, oops, you're on the right slide. I was going one past that. So what I found out is after Dunn was forced to put this sort of apology or admission in the church news, he immediately crafts a letter and sends it out to a lot of people and basically undoes his partial admission. He says, "Wish to clarify that I never fabricated, never created fictional stories about myself. I have experienced the events I have related. In the details, a very small number of stories, I've not been as careful as I should have been. I have on occasion embellished a story a few times. This is just a big lie." He's just trying to put the best face on it, and he's trying to undo all of this negative publicity that resulted when he put that in the church news. And later, after Paul Dunn dies, his wife would make the statement that he didn't even write that letter, that he was just forced to sign it.
The previous one.
The previous one.
So you're saying that this letter where he apologized in the church news, that Paul Dunn claimed that the church made him sign that letter, but that he didn't write it and that he never meant it and that he was never guilty.
Yeah. And so he just undoes it. I mean, he clearly is sociopathic. That is, he has no conscience. He's just looking out for himself, and he has no remorse for having misled so many people for so long. Then you go to the next slide, and I'm just pointing out that
this wasn't the first time this happened.
right, something very similar happened where Douglas Stringfellow told this story about being with a special unit that goes into Germany and captures a scientist and does all these heroic things.
This is in 1946.
Yeah, and he's elected to Congress on that basis. He's on the television show, This Is Your Life. They're able to put together a This Is Your Life show based on something that didn't happen. The reason I bring this up is that he lived in Paul Dunn's stake in 1946. And it was in church that he honed and developed this story. And I'm convinced that it's almost to a certainty that Paul Dunn would have heard this talk on more than one occasion and may have patterned his own stories after Douglas Stringfellow's. But I don't know.
You write on the slide that in 1954, the LDS church leaders required Congressman Douglas Stringfellow to go on KSL and confess his fabricated stories.
There's a big story behind it. I have a little bit of it in my book, but there's a lot of places that you can read about it. It's a very interesting story. Then the next slide.
So it didn't turn out so well for Stringfellow, but so you got to wonder why Dunn would take a page out of his playbook if that didn't turn out so well for him.
How effective it was, and that he may not have ever been caught. And Paul Dunn may not have ever been caught. If I hadn't started researching it, he would have died, and even then, it probably never would have come out.
Really quickly, I just want to share the First Presidency statement. My good friend Gerardo shared this with me, and I want to get your reaction to this. I'll read it. First Presidency statement. The First Presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints issued the following statement on Friday. In consideration of factors of age and health, Elder Paul H. Dunn was given emeritus status on September 30th, 1989, along with 7 other general authorities. Quote, we have had no way of fully or finally verifying the accuracy, the inaccuracy of the current allegations or accounts that are now under challenge. We are naturally concerned about the well-being of Elder Dunn and his family during his stressful time. We appreciate the service Elder Dunn has given and the sacrifices he and his family have made, often at the cost of their own comfort and health. What was and is your reaction to the church's statement on Paul Dunn?
Well, I don't know the date of it. I don't think that was near the time the story broke. I think that was later, near the time of his death. And if you go to the next slide, the obituary, which is just amazing, here's the obituary in 98.
This is in the Deseret News.
Yeah, in the Deseret News, which is long after the Arizona Republic, my Sunstone story, I believe, and all of that. And it still calls him a former professional baseball player, still says he played for the Cardinals, that he resumed his baseball career until a broken collarbone stopped it, and that he was given emeritus status because of age and health. It's all false. I know why he was given emeritus status, because I was in the middle of it. At the beginning, the middle, and the end. He was given emeritus status because he had become a liability to the church. And they wanted to make sure that if the story broke, he was not a sitting general authority. And they accomplished that. And I pretty much allowed it to happen, and pretty much had to, because I couldn't get anybody to do the story. Then if you go to the next slide, as we get near the end of this,
I just want to say that it's this weird thing that the church will do some sort of action so that they can have plausible deniability, but then continue to perpetuate the misperceptions
Yeah.
ongoing. So they do both. They do something that the lawyers tell them to do so that they can point to it. But then with the general membership, they keep the fibs going.
Yeah. Once you start lying, it's hard to break away, and that's why you so often, and this is not, as you know, not at all unique to Mormonism, is that's when cover-ups begin, and that's when cover-ups often become bigger than the lie itself, because it's so sinister, it's so devious, it's so pathetic. But if you go then to the next slide, what this shows is a couple of things. It's getting to where I have another meeting with my Uncle Boyd about this. But the slide or the photo on the right shows Paul Dunn's funeral. I took that shot. I went to the funeral. I didn't go into the main hall. I went into a cry room or something because I didn't want to create a spectacle, but I wanted to record everything that was said about Paul Dunn. And that was the funeral. Shortly before his death, he got involved with another individual by the name of Wade Cook, I think up in the Seattle area. And the two of them went around promoting Paul Dunn's new book and Wade Cook's promotional stuff.
It was like financial investment stuff.
Yeah. And later, this was like a couple of years later, Wade Cook was convicted of fraud, and they threw the book at him. He was in prison a long time. But Paul Dunn was gone by then. And Paul Dunn was going to join Wade Cook's board. Right at the time he died, they had announced, I'm going to be on Wade Cook's board. So he would have faced the possibility of being prosecuted another time for.
He didn't even stop. He didn't even stop the fraud.
No, he didn't. And the one shot you see of the Jazz is just to remind people that Wade Cook had little banners on the team's seats. You'd see Wade Cook, an email address or something like that. And then I think I talk about it. Oh, I'm going to talk about it on this slide. I just packed a lot of stuff in. So go back to that slide for a second. Is that after Paul Dunn's funeral was probably the most interesting discussion I had with Boyd about that. He called me into his office. And I don't remember the main reason. This may have been the main reason. I'd have to look at my notes, and I haven't done it. But he smiled at me and he said, I know you were at Paul Dunn's funeral. I said, yes, I was, as they're recording and taking photos. And then he has the broadest smile. And he said, you noticed who wasn't there. You noticed who wasn't there, meaning him. He wanted to get that message through. And this is the first direct indication I had that they had been out of sorts since probably 1954. And that
Boyd K. Packer and Paul H. Dunn were not on good terms.
Right, yeah. And
tell us why. Tell us why.
Well, because we never went into great detail, but it was because I think Boyd did not appreciate his war stories. Remember Boyd in the service was in the Pacific and had landed and did work on some of the islands that Dunn had been at previously. He would have known about some of this. And he knows that you shouldn't sensationalize war. He didn't like talking about war much himself. He did, but he didn't like it. But it was also during that meeting that Boyd told me, he said, there may be something else. And remember, Dunn is now dead. The story is now out. Boyd knows that I may or may not come out with a book because I hadn't at that point. And then Dunn said, there's something else you ought to look into. He said, Paul Dunn's got involved with another guy, and I can't think of his name right now. Maybe you should look into that. This is the first and only time anybody has said, maybe you should look into something. And it's long after Paul Dunn is gone. And so I don't know how long it was. Again, it's in my notes and it's in my book, is that I get a call. And it's from Boyd. And he said, I remembered the name. It's Wade Cook. True story. Anyway, we're really getting close to the end. And,
hey, this is your only shot to tell the story, so don't rush unless you've got to go.
okay. Well, I sort of get tired after doing this, but
Yeah. I appreciate your generosity.
Gerald Wingate, remember the one that he's been involved in business with on several occasions. He's eventually convicted of fraud and serves time at a federal penitentiary in Colorado. The next slide shows Paul Dunn's daughter with President Monson the day her mother dies, which is, of course, after Paul Dunn dies. And I just pointed out again that, or I point out here, I didn't point out again, that Paul Dunn told friends that Monson also embellished stories. Like, so when he got in discussions with some people, he would say, well, I'm not the only one who does this. And then I just toss in one example that I was aware of Thomas Monson, because when I worked at KSL, sometimes, and this job was sort of passed around as you'd cover conference, we got the speeches in advance. So we would get the speeches in advance. We would read them and highlight what we thought was the most important part. And then we would be sure to get the tape and pull those sound bites. And so you would often be aware in advance of what they were going to say. And so in 1975, President Monson has this dramatic moment during one of his talks in conference. And he says, I've been prompted by the Spirit to divert from my prepared text. This is the prepared text that we get. And at that point, he looks up in the audience and he describes a couple of people in the audience. And of course, that was all in the prepared text. It was just for dramatic effect.
That was in the prepared text where he says that he's inspired to go off script.
Yeah, and so but see, it's dramatic if you like make people think that, okay, I'm here and okay, all of a sudden I'm inspired and I need to depart for a minute because it now occurs to me that there's something important. And that's not the only story that he was possibly had embellished or made up some way. And
because it can't be that Dunn was the only one who did this. And the only reason that anyone knows about this is because you did it. And the only reason you did it is because you had the courage to do it, because you got fired for doing it and you got pressured and threatened by all levels of church administration for pursuing it. And most people aren't that courageous, or they can't afford to lose their job. So how many stories have been deep-sixed or never covered or have been hidden in all sorts of areas within Mormonism because there weren't courageous, capable people that could tell the story.
Yeah, I think that the church would have been a lot better off had there been good news reporting all along, which the Trib tried to do for many years until they got in bed with the Deseret News and started pulling back. There was a time when reporters covered the church office building. I knew a reporter when I covered city county buildings, Scoop Williams, who told stories of covering the church office building, going in and talking to the president of the church as a reporter, getting quotes directly, just as when I covered the Capitol, I could go into Governor Rampton's office and sit down and have a chat. But that quickly disappeared with the church, and it's also disappeared in state office. You have to go through layers of people for reporters usually to get to these people. And if it looks like it's getting dark, the sun is going down, so my face is only being lit.
Don't worry about that.
By my computer.
Most of our listeners don't even check the video out. Okay, I think we're at the end, though. This is a controversial slide because it's kind of polarizing. It's got Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump and Gordon B. Hinckley, and it asks, why do public figures lie? I think this gets to the crux of how we're ending.
Yeah, this slide is one. I only did one book signing at one bookstore, and I think 5 people showed up. this book, I made up my mind at some point, given the Paul Dunn's rancor against my uncle and his false accusations against my uncle, I made up my mind I wasn't going to publish the book until Boyd died. And so I held up publication for several years. And so by the time the book came out, nobody read it. Nobody wanted to review it. Nobody cared. I did one book signing at one bookstore, and I think 4 or 5 people showed up. And the slide you just showed was in that presentation I made at the bookstore. And I just wanted to bring up why do they lie? Hillary Clinton, it could be President Hinckley, it could be Donald Trump. Why do they? And I think I told you this before, but one of the things I told students repeatedly over the years is that you would be surprised how many public officials lie, and you know it as you're holding the microphone there, interviewing them, and they're saying it, and you're taping it, and you know that it's a lie. And I said, because lies are usually effective. I said, and in this slide, I said, maybe they think their adherents can't handle the truth. And I think that's sometimes the case with the church, is that they're not as sinister as you think, that this could be pretty bad if they heard this. They're being protective. I don't agree with it, but I understand that. And sometimes I think it's the leaders themselves can't handle the truth, and so they lie. And I think that's more often the case. And then mostly it's because lies are just usually damn effective. Lying is really effective. I don't care if you're selling insurance, if you're going door to door selling solar panels or Bibles or whatever it is you're selling, if you're a candidate running for office, lies often are extremely effective and are difficult to overcome with facts. And so that's that slide.
Yeah, and something that I think we can all agree upon, whether you support Trump and the Republicans or whether you support the Democrats and Biden, is you think the other side's lying, and you have to notice that lying persuades people and it moves people emotionally, and it's successful because if you hate Trump got elected. If you believe Trump's a liar, then Trump got elected and he's survived through lies. And if you hate Hillary and if you hate Biden, then you're going to say that lies got them elected. And so either way, we just have to acknowledge that lying works.
Mm-hmm. Very effective.
It's effective.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I do have a few questions. Do you mind if I ask you a few final questions, Lynn?
Sure.
You've been super generous. Are you sure you're okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And this whole ghoulish light off of my screen.
Don't worry about that. Don't worry about the image. It's been great. Okay. So, do you feel like the church has changed as a result of the Paul Dunn scandal? Have they changed? You know, I've heard that the church kicked all the general authorities off of corporate boards. I hear the church has a really firm policy now about, general authorities doing any endorsements. I'm guessing that the church is always picking general authorities that won't become like Paul Dunn, and they're monitoring general authorities to make sure that nobody gets too charismatic and too, successful, although Jeffrey Holland, maybe be an exception. And some have even questioned Jeffrey Holland's truth-telling in some of the stories he's told. But do you think that the church has learned any lessons from all this?
I think my recollection is that they started dialing back the board of director thing earlier, that Paul Dunn was maybe hanging on against the advice of the brethren. I'm not sure about that because I had this discussion once with my uncle. I don't recall what all we talked about, but I know that at one point he was on the board of Zion's Bank and then stepped back. But I think that was prompted by an earlier embarrassing fraud. There's been a series of them. They don't end. And because there were other general authorities on other boards that got caught up in scandal that I've written about, and I wrote about in the one Utah Holiday article story. I think the church has learned some lessons. It's like I said, when I met with Elder Haight and Fyans, is that there was just no animosity. It was if you could call it, I mean, the subject matter was very controversial, but it was a pleasant exchange. These were not mean-spirited guys. I think they had concern for me. I think they had concern for Paul Dunn, but mostly they had concern for people, as they expressed it, who he had brought into the church, which probably numbered in the thousands.
Hmm. Okay. Somebody, let's see. Jan writes, what about his wife? Did she ever call him on the lies? And that's the other thing. Didn't he have brothers or sisters or siblings or anyone that could actually speak up and say he wasn't on that baseball team, or that war story wasn't true? Were there any family members that could have called him out that didn't?
His brothers could have, but they didn't. My wife, of course, was in the middle of this and faced all the pressure that I faced, because when your job is in jeopardy, that's putting food on the table. When I was first covering it, before the story broke, Grant Affleck called her at home and was very threatening in the call and scared her and upset her about it, because he was so desperate. Remember, this is a company that was going under, and a single news story would have moved up their bankruptcy date by several months. And he was scrambling to find the money through a Japanese investment to pay everybody off. And that never came about. And it turned out that there was fraud associated with that potential deal. So his company had no hope. It was going to go down. But yeah, I mean, she's lived the whole Packer family thing. She became part of the extended family, fit in very well. We, as I said in a previous video with you, that it was just a great experience, a great thing to be a part of. And she tracked it and knew about it all along.
One of our listeners asked, did the Osmonds or Steve Young or any of the famous people attend Paul H. Dunn's funeral?
That's a good question. I'm almost certain Steve Young was not there. There could have been, and I think there was, I recall there was a couple of Osmond brothers there. I think I remember in the parking lot going out when they were taking the casket out. I was standing back. I was staying at the perimeter. I did not want to disrupt the funeral. Some people were critical that I showed up at all, and maybe that's a valid complaint, but I stood back, and I think I remember seeing one or two Osmond brothers going to their car after, it seems like. But remember, I'm not in the main part of the chapel. I'm back in a cry room where I can't see who all is there.
What about people that say Lynn Packer just hates the church? He has an axe to grind. He's just negative. He was just trying to find some way to take the church down. What types of criticisms have you received for doing this and other like stories? And to what extent are they true or not true?
Well, sure, you get that criticism because people who don't like what you're reporting assign bad motives to it. But the reporting I did about the church represents a very, very small fraction of all the reporting I did. We've highlighted it, so it may seem like that's all I did was reporting. I would say I did thousands of stories over the years, in the thousands, and most of them had nothing to do with the church like this. And you would get the same sort of criticism about political stories that you did. You're out to get this politician. Business stories, you're out to get this business. You hate it. It's journalism. It's what journalists do. And if you have a complaint, what you should do is analyze and see whether the reporter has applied basic journalism tenets to the story. Is it accurate? Did they give both sides a chance to respond? And do they try and put their thumb on the story balance scale as the story is being told? And I worked hard to not do that. And that's what I taught at BYU. And it's one of the reasons I was hired at BYU. They wanted students coming out of BYU to practice traditional journalism methods and apply the tenets. And that's what I taught.
You chose the title Lying for the Lord. And in the Sunstone article, which we'll share in the show notes for the podcast, you actually have some excerpts, I think, from the Arizona Republic's interview of Paul H. Dunn. I was surprised he was even willing to do an interview. But in that discussion, he basically says, look, I never told any lies. I basically, my heart was always in the right place. I just wanted to inspire the youth of the church to do good. And everything I said in my stories were true. Just sometimes I would take truths from two stories and then merge them together just so that I could teach good principles, but they were not lies. And my heart was always in a good place. I never made myself the hero. And so what's wrong? And I even know people, friends right now that sort of say, what's so wrong? What's so bad about this? He's, and even Paul Dunn uses the justification. I was so bewildered. He says the creation story isn't true. He says the flood story isn't true. Like the foundation of the Old Testament and thus the Bible, we know that they're not real stories. So Paul H. Dunn himself basically said, religion is about stories that are often myth, but as long as they inspire, that's the important thing. What is your response to all of that reasoning and or justification?
Well, that's one way of looking at it. Of course, I disagree with it. I think that
Why?
A little embellishing once in a while for some drama to me is okay, but making up stories out of whole cloth, I think that's absolutely wrong. And about that interview that Paul Dunn did with the Arizona Republic is he was taking a big risk. He was taking the risk that if he met with the reporter, allowed the conversation to be taped, he brought in some new evidence proving that he did this at the Philippines and had this affidavit and some other things, that the Arizona Republic would drop the story. Now, if you want to hear the story behind the story is the Arizona Republic told me if Paul Dunn had not done that interview, they were not going to do the story. They knew it was that controversial. And if they couldn't meet with him face to face and draw conclusions face to face. And so what does that tell you is that they did end up doing the story and they did not believe what Dunn told them during the interview, the statement that you just quoted.
What about just this idea that his stories weren't fabricated, they were just kind of embellished or merged, but he really didn't tell lies?
Well, that's what he says. I mean, and of course, that's not true. They were all made up. Even when you read my book, you'll see where I'll find that he, on a couple of occasions, knew someone that it happened to, and so he could tell the story with great conviction and emotion. It just didn't happen to him.
Do you have any reason to have a belief about Paul H. Dunn's testimony, let's say before he got busted, during and or after? At any point, do you have a sense that he either lost his testimony or was like a super liberal Mormon? And by the way, I also would love your thoughts on the extent to which he believed that the church should be more honest and open about its own history. Those are two questions, but try and deal with them both if you can.
Yeah, that's right. I think had I been at that meeting in 1954 when they were deciding what path church education should go down, and had Paul Dunn said what he probably did say, and my uncle said what he would have said, I would have probably sided with Paul. Well, I would have sided with Paul Dunn. Because remember, Paul Dunn went to a school that it was Chapman College that was a religious school. They turned out preachers. He would have had a formal education in New Testament and the Old Testament. He was an academic, and he probably believed that's the way It should be taught. He didn't go to BYU and take institute classes and get quasi brainwashed. He got what would be probably a more accurate view of what the Bible meant. And yeah, so Steve, what was the other part of your question?
You think he lost his faith in Mormonism?
Yeah, I think he did.
When?
I think what had happened that I didn't mention is that I found out what happened. Remember in the Church News article, it said, I've done some things that aren't becoming of a general authority that I'm apologizing for. What that was at least 2 women had come forward and alleged some sort of sexual impropriety. I never found out what it was. My source would only say that was what it was, whether it was just touching or actual sex. I have no idea. My source would absolutely not tell me, but gave me a lot of detail. Is that normally something like this would go to a bishop or a stake president. You've been through the system, you know how it works. But in this case, the quorum of 12 formed a special body to review this, and they did not believe him. And he was given a form of excommunication. It wasn't full excommunication, but it was a form. And one of the things involved was not being able to take the sacrament. And that's the way they handled that. And I think that as that was going on and after it happened, he felt like, hey, I was a superstar. I delivered all of these converts. I added a lot of pizzazz to the church with athletes and actors and such. And I think he really felt betrayed. And I don't know if I put it in the book, but I interviewed someone who was close to Paul Dunn during this time period. And he thought that he had pretty much lost his, what you would call testimony, or lost his faith in the church.
There's a decent chance he had had a second anointing. And that's always a tricky thing, because the second anointing is supposed to mean you're set to the celestial kingdom. Yeah. But if you commit adultery or lose your faith, what can the church do with you? Because you're supposed to be saved in the high heavens, right?
Yeah. Yeah. The second anointing thing never came up. I never heard whether he did or not.
Okay. So let's see. There are a couple other. Oh, okay. So one of the things that I'm really saddened about is Sunstone magazine played such an important role in the church in the 80s and 90s. Mm-hmm. And it was obviously one of the only outlets that would publish your story. And but I think it was even hard for you to get Sunstone to cover it. But now Sunstone doesn't even have, as far as I'm aware, a magazine anymore. And there aren't people, it doesn't seem like there's people doing journalism on the LDS Church these days. You know, you don't get the sense that Peggy Fletcher Stack is really doing this much. We know she's a believer in the church, and now we know the Salt Lake Tribune is owned by one of the Huntsmans who's a believer. And, you know, the Salt Lake Tribune just canceled. It's just announced it's no longer doing print, print newspapers. I think the Deseret News might be ramping that down as well. Sure. Like, it's so sad to me that Mormon journalism is dying, and it's been dying, and it's about to almost be extinguished. And I'm outraged, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts or feelings about that.
Well, I said that journalism generally was in free fall. It's not going to get better in my lifetime.
Any journalism?
All journalism, whether it's political, business, church, all of it. You have pockets of good journalism remaining, but that's few and far between. You have so many papers going under completely. There's going to be more go under. And then it's going to affect the quality of journalism schools, because you'd have to have a screw loose to go into journalism right now. So you get a lot of people going in for the wrong reason. They're not going to be that well trained. I never saw this coming. And it really saddens me to see this.
And I guess it makes me wonder, who's going to help government and churches and the state, be accountable,
Heaven help Utah. It's become a one-party state, and the Republican grip on Utah will only get tighter.
My dear friend Lance Frazier, love you, Lance. He's a journalist. He writes, journalism isn't dying, it's just changing platforms. And I hope that's true, Lance. I mean, I'm trying to be a part of that, but I'm not doing investigative journalism like you did.
I disagree with that. It is changing platforms. I mean, he's right. But the way it's changing platforms is not good, because they're still, even though there's the internet and the possibility, they just don't make the money on the internet the way they did in print and broadcast the way that it was. The dollars are not there. To have journalism, you have to be able to pay well, and you have to be able to have the wherewithal to finance in-depth and investigative reporting, which takes a lot longer. And you have to have a kitty build up so that if you get the inevitable libel suits, you can sustain those that can run up to $1 million without taking your publication down. And that's what they face now. A lot of the fear now of doing investigative reporting is not just because, well, a lot of them don't even have the reporters who can do it, but one libel suit could end, put you completely out of business.
One listener asks if journalists can be bought off, and I would change that a little bit to pressured. And I'll just say one thing I know is that when Peggy Fletcher Stack caught wind through the bloggernacle that Marlin Jensen had apologized to the Oakland members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for the treatment of LGBT people. And this was many, many years ago. Mm-hmm. Marlin found out that Peggy was going to be writing an article about that. And Marlin asked Peggy not to publish the article, and she agreed. And Marlin Jensen told me this himself. So, that's just one of probably a billion examples of where the church can pressure journalists not to run stories. But is that your experience? I mean, obviously.
Yeah, right now you have no idea what's going on, either in government or church or business. The coverage is just, it's just really poor. Like your viewer said, it is switching platforms. He's right about that, but just not successfully. And that's one of the reasons that I'm pushing smartphone news gathering, because it cuts costs. So if you're going to report aggressively, either you've got to have more money coming in or reduce the cost of producing a video story. And that's what all of my articles have been about.
What would you say, and this is probably, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I want to just address it explicitly. We talked about this with the Mark Hoffman thing, but what does the Paul H. Dunn story tell us about the brethren, more LDS church leaders' claims to be inspired of God and to have the spirit of discernment and to have kind of a special communication with God and the Holy Ghost?
Well, if they have it, it must be God's choice as to when he wants to inspire them, because it's not something that you switch on and it stays on, because of the times that they've been hoodwinked by Paul Dunn, by Mark Hoffman. And there's a longer list of people who have deceived leaders of the church specifically, and members generally.
But I would just add, it's not just the church leaders that have been deceived. It's church leaders that have led with the deception, whether it's Joseph Smith and the Golden Plates, the Book of Abraham, polygamy, the Masonic Lodge temple ceremony, all the way through to modern day. We've been covering it this year on Mormon Stories, the secret Mormon meetings, B.H. Roberts, Fawn Brody, just all the way through. It's just this 200 years of just of false information, of affinity fraud, and then of coercion and punishment of anyone who tries to uncover the truth.
Well, that's the thread that runs through that 1989 story I did for Utah Holiday that was titled Mormon Fraud. It tracks that through. And I am certain that a lot of this stuff applies to almost every religion. And people who know about it or are concerned about it have to have the hope or belief that the good that comes out of the religion fully outweighs the bad. And that's a judgment everybody has to make for himself.
A lot of people want to know about your personal beliefs in your faith. And that can be in the LDS Church and or just God and Jesus or spiritual. Is there anything you want to share about your own personal relationship with the church or your religious or spiritual beliefs or non-beliefs?
Yeah, I just call myself a don't knower. I don't know, and I don't think that, at least until science is further developed, that we can know if there really is a God, if there really is a life after death. I don't know. One of the differences is I don't think anybody does. I think people say they know, but I really don't believe it. I think that's just, it's the nature of the beast. You know, we're born, we're here, we look around, we see what's going on. We're very limited in what we understand and can comprehend. We want to figure out what's the meaning, why are we here, what are we supposed to do, where are we going to go? You know, the basic questions that you brought up as a missionary. But where the Mormon Church says we know where we were, we know why we're here, we know where we're going. I don't.
Can you know if the Mormon Church is true, if the Book of Mormon is true, if the Book of Abraham is true? Can you know that?
Basically, I answered that. No, I don't think anybody knows.
No, but can they know that it's not true? In other words, in your opinion, is there enough evidence to condemn the Book of Mormon, the Book of Abraham, Joseph Smith as being works of fraudulent works versus, works of God or true translations of ancient records or scripture?
Well, some facts do shed light on some of the claims in the Book of Mormon, and factually they don't stand up. My problem with the Book of Mormon, we could take a long time talking about this, is the doctrine. I think that it's a totally racist book. I think it's an embarrassment to the church. It's an embarrassment to members that say that it's the work of God. It is just so racist. That's the most troubling part, and that doesn't have to. That more is a doctrinal problem that I have with it. Besides believing that there's not a lot of factual support there, I am sure that some people through the Book of Mormon look at scriptures that motivate them to be better people. Same with the Bible. And that's a good thing if they can do that. But for a lot of people, the Book of Mormon gave them cover to be racist. And that's a bad thing.
And so why not just stay in the church as a cultural member, as a social member, to get the social benefits, the moral benefits?
Mm-hmm. Well, I liked the social benefits. I liked the community very much. Church basketball was a big draw. I had a lot of friends. I taught Sunday school and priesthood for years and years and years at different wards. And I was engaged in all of that. And when we had a phone call earlier, I said, one of the big factors driving me into inactivity was just the boredom of it, just the repeating the same thing over and over again. And with my wife, the one thing that triggered her to not want to go to a sacrament meeting again, and we don't regularly, we'll go to a family event for sure, or a funeral, but it was a talk that was given over the pulpit, and the person just trashed Barack Obama. And she left that sacrament meeting, and in terms of regular attendance, never went back since. She was deeply offended by that, as was I, but she more than I was.
Did Uncle Boyd K. Packer ever, did you have any final words with him? Did he ever express disappointment in you or being proud of you? Do you have any final sort of moments with him?
My feeling was based on a couple of meetings that he was proud that I had become a fairly accomplished reporter, and I think he enjoyed our talks, even though we disagreed on certain points. But that's just my impression.
Overall, are you proud to have been his nephew, or embarrassed, or both?
Well, I think he was an extraordinarily gifted person. And it was known early in his life that this was somebody unusual who had a lot of talent, a lot of talent. And I'm very disappointed, extremely, on some of his stands, especially on the gay issue. But other than that, I admired him for what he had accomplished, but not for what, in that case, he had preached. And I disagree with the direction that he took the seminaries. And
In what way?
well, in the way that we had this discussion. That's what my video is about, where instead of it being more academic and more based on fact, it's more based on testimony and belief,
Emotion.
how you feel about something rather than what you think about it.
Right. Last question that I could think of, and you've been so generous with your time. You had mentioned to me that in an interview I did with Greg Prince, and by the way, I remember talking to Greg Prince when he was after he had just published the David O. McKay book, and he was doing investigation for the Leonard Arrington book. At some point along that process, before or after the David O. McKay book, he interviewed Paul H. Dunn and wanted to write a Paul H. Dunn book. But my sense was that at first he didn't do it because the people involved asked him to wait until Paul H. Dunn was dead. But then at some point something happened, and even though he had all the good materials and all the interviews to do a Paul H. Dunn book, he decided not to do it, and he did a couple other books. I think you had mentioned that he was critical of you in your in your work on Paul H. Dunn, and that it maybe at some point he even was fooled a little bit. But is there anything you want to say? Not Greg Prince is a friend of mine. We all love him. Is there anything you want to say about Greg Prince, your book, Paul H. Dunn, or any of that?
Yeah. I was aware that early on he was critical of what I'd reported. I think he initially believed Paul Dunn. As I was doing research, Dunn wanted to do have an official biography done. He had a lot of material that he had collected, photographs, artifacts, memorabilia. And he wanted that done, and he had made an arrangement with Greg Prince for him to do that. They met on several occasions, I believe. I think Dunn went back to his house in, where is it, New York or somewhere?
I was in Maryland.
And stayed with him. I think they became friends. I think that's why he was initially defensive or protective of Paul Dunn. But over time, we made contact. We had multiple times I think, spoke on the phone or exchanged emails. He would not give me the draft of the book that he had been working on, but I got it from another source. So I had that. He would not give me, he had done a lot of work and had done a lot of interviews. He would not give me all of the interviews, but when I made a case that, hey, I need this one, I need that one, he would give me the interviews. When all is said and done, I think that what he gave me made a substantial and important contribution to the book.
Okay. Well, shout out to Greg Prince. We love you if he even watches this or hears it.
Great job with his David O. McKay biography.
Would you ever write a biography on your uncle?
Probably not, but I might at some point write an article or do something. I might dig out all my notes that I haven't gone over for years. Some of my conversations with Boyd, some selected excerpts are in the book, in one of the sort of backstory or footnotes on page 300 and something or other. Some of them are, but there's a lot of them that I still have not shared with anybody.
So you got more stuff.
He's going to be seen more as the caring individual that I think he was. That care was just taken in a direction that I don't think it should have gone.
Yeah, someone very close to me worked directly with Boyd K. Packer and says he's actually a really lovely guy, which is so weird because he's so hated. He was so despised by progressive and liberal Mormons because of his stances on LGBT people.
Right.
And many attribute, thousands of suicides and premature deaths to his emphasis on LGBTQ policies that were so harmful. So it's got to be hard to love this man and see that he's a kind, good, loving man, and to know that he's so hated, and that by many accounts he did so much harm.
Yeah. And like I said, I had the opportunity during a telephone conversation to just say flat out, Boyd, on the gay issue, you are dead wrong. And that was that was the last in-depth conversation I had with him. When I talked to him after that at family get-togethers, we didn't engage in any chit-chat about any of these matters.
Because you burned a bridge a little bit, went too far, maybe?
No, there just wasn't the opportunity there.
Okay.
It wasn't the opportunity. And
did he tell you why he cared so much about that issue?
Well, he just had the belief. I mean, it was just a strong belief that is shared by a lot of Mormons that it's just unnatural, and it's by choice, and maybe even he believed in the devil. He believed in this sinister force. I don't. And so he believed that in some cases, at best, it's a choice, and at worst, it's promptings of the devil, which, of course, I just completely reject.
Yeah. Well, the last thing I just want to say is that for those who've been following, there was a general authority that was excommunicated recently, James J. Hamula, and there's kind of the whisperings about why he was excommunicated, but the truth is, when something like this happens, or with George P. Lee or others, you really don't know why. You really don't know the full story about why these things happen, because if the church wants to cover something up, they can. And so for me, I just want to leave that as a thought for anyone who wants to do more history, who wants to do investigative journalism. There are things that we never hear that happen. And then there are things that we do hear that happen, but we probably don't get the full or the real story about why they happened. Yeah. And I think to end, I just want to say on behalf of all my listeners, on behalf of Mormons everywhere, Lynn Packer, your professionalism, your journalism, your integrity, not just with the Paul Dunn story, but with all these stories, has meant so much to so many of us. You deserve to have sold your book by the tens or hundreds of thousands. You deserve to be a household name as somebody who has done so much good for so many of us. And I'm grateful that we can just take this moment to honor you, to have you tell your story, and to personally thank you on behalf of tens of thousands of Mormon Stories listeners for your contributions to our well-being. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And it's been my pleasure.
Are you worn out? Are you ready to go?
Yes, and I'm going to disappear into the dark. It's now dark out.
All right, Lynn. Well, everybody's thanking you. Thank you so much. And by the way, we're having you back. If you're willing to come back, we're going to have Lynn Packer back for at least one more story, which is we basically want to apply all these concepts of power and greed and politics and money and corruption to Tim Ballard and Operation Underground Railroad. And many people are going to be like, what? He's protecting children from abuse. Mm-hmm. Well, you have a different perspective, and that's that's going to be potentially our final interview with you. Is that right, Lynn?
Yeah, I look forward to that.
Or at least our next one, maybe not our final one.
Yeah.
All right, don't stop the work, Lynn Packer.
All right, see you.
We need you.
See you.
All right, fade away. Thanks, Lynn. And this is John Dunn, thanking you all for joining us for a full day of Mormon Stories podcast interviews. This has been so great to have Lynn Packer. Thanks to everyone who's joined us. We had 500 to 600 people joining us for this entire interview. It's been amazing. Thanks to everyone who commented on Facebook and on YouTube. Thanks to everyone who donates to the Open Stories to make it possible. And I'll just make my plea again. If you value this type of programming, if you want to see it continue, less than 1 out of 1,000 listeners actually donates to the Open Stories Foundation or to Mormon Stories. So please, 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 if you want to see stuff like this continue, if you want to have other journalism, if Lance Fraser's right, if Mormon Stories podcast is a form of modern journalism, as the Salt Lake Tribune takes a dive, as the Deseret News continues to be bankrupt in terms of its integrity with reporting, if you want to see there be some breath of life of true, factual, critical journalism within Mormonism, support Mormon Stories. That's one thing you can do. Go to mormonstories.org, click on the donate button at the top, become a monthly donor. That will make the difference. That will keep us alive. Please tell your friends and family. Please share this podcast everywhere you can. Like us on Facebook. Give us a positive review on Facebook, Mormon Stories podcast page. Give us a positive review on iTunes. Subscribe to us on YouTube and on Facebook. Spread the word. All that stuff helps. Give us your feedback at mormonstories@gmail.com. Comment at mormonstories.org. That's always useful, or on YouTube or Facebook. And support other, podcasts like Radio Free Mormon. Radio Free Mormon does amazing work. They deserve your support as well. Marriage on a Tightrope is an amazing podcast. There are others as well. We just need your support. And if you want to see there be any chance of truth and openness and candor within Mormonism, please support us. Thanks so much to everyone. Love you guys. Means the world, your support. Please stay in touch. Let us know if you have other good stories that you want us to share. And we'll see you guys all again very soon on Mormon Stories podcast. Take care, everybody. Thanks so much. Oh, and please buy the book. The book is Lying for the Lord, the Paul H. Dunn Stories by Lynn Kenneth Packer. He deserves your support. Everyone should own a copy of this book. It's a powerful book. So please support it. Thanks, everyone. You guys take care. And we'll see you all guys again soon on another